In the hush of an old Tudor night, a single candle trembles against a draught that weaves through stone corridors and tapestried walls. Its flame leans left, then right, as if listening for footsteps that may never come. Somewhere deeper inside Hampton Court, the breath of Henry VIII rattles behind a velvet curtain. But here, near the low-burning wick, time slows like a dying clock. A mouse scratches at the baseboard, but the sound barely registers against the layered hush of ancient prayers and forgotten oaths. Outside, the wind sweeps across the frozen gardens, rattling the bare branches of an orchard once planted for a queen long dead. The walls remember her laughter, how it clung to the beams when he was young, before the weight of the crown sank into his bones and bent him into this bed of sickness and rot. Tonight, the Tudor house feels alive, its beams and floors swollen with breath and memory. Lone guard shifts his spear along the gallery, leather boots whispering across the flagstones. He does not dare glance at the heavy door behind which his sovereign lies. But his heart beats a prayer all the same. For mercy, for silence, for dawn to come without blood. In the small hours, the candle burns lower, casting shadows that flicker like ghostly courtiers in stiff brocade. Some say this house is haunted by the souls Henry discarded. Wives who wept beneath the executioner's axe, friends whose heads rolled onto straw because power must feed itself. If one listens closely, they say, the stone will tell stories through the walls, secrets soaked into the mortar by trembling lips. A distant bell tolls the hour, a hollow chime that drifts through the rafters. It is not meant for the living anymore, but for those who hover between one breath and the next. A physician stands nearby, holding a vial of something thick and bitter. He does not know if it will help. He only knows that kings die as surely as stable boys, and that to speak this aloud would be treason, even as the candle sputters. Beyond the courtyard, the river waits, dark and endless, bearing away secrets on its tide. Some believe the Thames itself will carry Henry's sins away when his heart gives its final shudder, but the stone floors know better. They keep each whisper, each betrayal folded into the grain like pressed flowers. Tonight, even the ghosts seem to wait. The velvet drapes hang heavy with the scent of sweat and sickness. The once mighty bed creaks when the king turns, a sound like old wood splitting under too much weight. A flicker of flame throws his shadow across the ceiling, bloated. Monstrous, yet fragile as the breath rattling in his chest. In a far corner of the chamber, a young page watches the candle. He knows it will not last till dawn. He prays for it to hold on, for the light to outlive the man who once roared like a lion through these halls. But the wax drips steadily, pooling on the battered floorboards. A pale testament to how even kings flicker out, leaving only the walls to remember. So, settle now. Let the stone walls cradle this secret hour. Let the candle burn lower, then lower still. Where are the watchers tonight? What time is it where they sit, waiting? Dim the lights. Let the hush fill every corner. Let your breath slow. Somewhere in the darkness, the king dreams of a hunting field, of thunderous hooves, of laughter echoing across a dawn that will never come again. And when the candle dies, the house will keep his secrets close until someone else dares to listen. Within the thick stone walls, the king's chamber draws each sound into itself, muffling footsteps, swallowing whispers. The tapestries shift in the draught like sails at sea, their threads faded from decades of firelight and breath. Near the carved bed, an ancient rug is worn bare where priests have knelt, pressing their prayers into the floor in hopes that heaven might bend an ear for a dying king. Henry lies sunken into the mattress, flesh grown heavy and loose, royal rings slipping over swollen fingers that once crushed goblets in drunken cheer. A fur coverlet rises and falls, uneven and shallow, each breath a labor drawn from a failing furnace. The sour scent of rot clings to the velvet cushions, weaving itself into every fold. A flicker of lamplight glimmers against the gilt edges of a prayer book left open on a small oak table. Its pages rustle when the wind crawls under the window panes. No one turns them now. No more sermons, no more absolution, whispered sweetly to soothe the weight of so many sins. The priest stands motionless at the foot of the bed, robes heavy with dust and old sweat. His lips move, but no sound escapes, as if the stone chamber has decided it will not carry words tonight. In the corner, a maid shifts her weight from foot to foot, clutching a basin that will soon be needed. Her eyes linger on the shape under the covers, that breathing mound of king and sickness. And she tries to remember the boyish face she once saw on a coin when she was small. It is not here now, not behind the scraggle of graying beard, not beneath the crusted lips that twitch at unseen dreams. Outside the door, the guard listens for a call that may never come. His halberd rests against the wall, polished bright but dulled in purpose. He has watched many men fall to sickness, but never a king. The hush in the corridor presses against his skull, making the torchlight swim. He pictures the stone monastery where his grandmother prayed for the souls of men who wielded swords like God's own justice. Men like this, yet not quite this. Inside, the chamber swells with warmth that is no comfort. A log collapses in the hearth, sending up a slow hiss of sparks. They drift upward, pale and soft, before vanishing against the blackened chimney stone. Somewhere under the fur coverlet, Henry's chest rattles. The priest leans closer, eyes clouded with dread, ears straining to catch the final confession that might never come. A clock hidden in the shadows ticks unevenly. Its wooden gears catch and slip, the rhythm like a heartbeat that does not know whether to go on. The maid dips a cloth into a bowl of lavender water, dabbing the king's temple, her hands shaking just enough for the droplets to splatter onto the pillow. She dares not meet his eyes that open only to see things no one else can see. When the hush deepens, the shadows shift again. The bed, the walls, the great oak chest at the foot of the mattress, all seem to breathe. The chamber knows this moment has been waiting for decades, folded carefully between the pages of royal decrees and gilded lies. It knows how kings are born, screaming, and die whispering. Their voices no different from the servant who sweeps the rushes each morning. In a small alcove, a rat scurries along the baseboard, sniffing the cold stone for crumbs that have fallen from the royal table. It pauses beneath a velvet chair, ears twitching at the cough that shudders through the air. For a heartbeat, everything holds. The log in the hearth shifts, the clock stutters, the king's breath catches. Then the hush closes around it all again. Somewhere in the darkness, a physician scribbles on parchment, his quill scratching like a beetle's legs on rotting wood. He knows these notes may one day be found, lines written in the hour when the king's flesh surrenders to something greater than gold. But he keeps writing, head bowed, candle guttering low, ink pooling where the words slip free. In the cold hush, the king's chamber grows still. Outside, the stars blink unseen above the frost-laden gardens. A garden planted for lovers and heirs, now ringed with the scent of damp stone and moss. If the wind carries a voice tonight, it does so gently, a memory of laughter echoing through corridors that have long since learned how to forget. So let the hush grow deeper. Let the fur coverlet rise and fall, a cradle for breath that slips further from the world with each moment. Let the chamber keep its silence, silence thick enough to hold secrets that once rattled like bones in the king's clenched fist. And beyond the door, the guard waits. The maid dabs the brow again. The priest whispers to his God, and the candle trembles on the small oak table, burning just brightly enough to see the face of a man who was once a lion, and is now only a whisper among stone walls that will remember him long after the last. Flame goes out. Down the long gallery that stretches away from the king's chamber, the shadows drift like breath held too long in a sleeping throat. Tall windows look out over gardens glazed with frost, but tonight the panes reflect only the torchlight that dances against ancient portraits hung in solemn rows. Each painted face watches with eyes that never close, each brushstroke a witness to the way power shifts in the dark. A young page slips along the edge of the wall, slippered feet making no sound on the polished oak boards. In his small fist, he carries a folded scrap of parchment, a note that must find its way to a chamberlain, or a confessor, or perhaps be burned before dawn breaks the spell of these halls. He pauses beneath the portrait of a queen, her painted hands resting lightly on a prayer book. Her lips seem to part in the flickering glow, as if she might whisper to him, might warn him that this house has never been gentle with secrets. A tapestry flutters near a doorway, stirring as if stirred by the memory of a draught. Beneath its woven hunting scene, a hidden passage coils through the walls, a vein of cold stone that servants know better than the lords who strut above. Rats slip through there unseen, trailing rumors in their wake. There are stories that the king himself once crept through such corridors to visit forbidden chambers. But tonight, no footsteps echo there, only the hush of stone listening to a dying heartbeat. Further down the gallery, a single torch crackles. Its flame catches the gilt frame of a portrait. The king in his prime, shoulders broad beneath ermine. Eyes bright with the hunger of a man who believed no sickness could ever sink its claws into his flesh. The real king lies behind those distant doors now, breath heavy with infection, a body bloated with too many feasts, too many enemies swallowed or beheaded to keep the crown safe. The page glances once at the painted eyes, then lowers his gaze. He knows better than to meet them for long. In this place, the air itself seems to shift when the king's name is spoken. Servants whisper of old curses sewn into the tapestries, of corridors that rearrange themselves when no one is looking. Tonight the hush is deeper than usual, as if the house holds its breath alongside the sovereign who can no longer roar. A distant clatter echoes from the far end. A dropped pail, maybe, or a startled guard letting his spear strike the stone. It dies quickly, muffled by heavy drapes and age-darkened beams. The page presses the note to his chest, the paper damp against his skin. He cannot read its ink, but he knows what it carries. Instructions for when the king's breath stops. Who will be summoned first? Who must bow? Who must run? Beyond the tall windows, the gardens lie still. Frost crusts the gravel paths where once Henry and his court strolled beneath banners and blossoms. Their laughter bright as bells. Now, the hedgerows bristle with the cold, branches etched white under a waning moon. Somewhere out there, the Thames glides past like an endless whisper, carrying away rumors to London's muddied streets. A guard stands beneath a portrait of a child who never lived to wear a crown. His gloved hand rests on the pommel of a sword that has never tasted blood. He shifts his weight, boots creaking, eyes flicking to the page who drifts closer. Neither speaks. Words are dangerous here. They twist in the shadows, root themselves in the cracks between stones. Better to stand silent, to let the house decide which secrets are worthy of breath. Past the guard, a small alcove hides an old chair, its velvet seat worn thin by decades of waiting. Once a lady-in-waiting sat there for hours, ears pressed to the door for the soft weeping of a queen doomed to lose her head. The chair remains a quiet witness to the way power unravels, thread by thread, heartbeat by heartbeat. The page slips the note into the guard's gloved palm. Fingers close over it like the jaws of a trap. No thanks, no nod. They understand. Above them, the ceiling groans, as if the house itself shifts its bones to listen. A chill drifts through the gallery, stirring the hems of tapestries, brushing cold fingers across painted faces that never sleep. The torch flickers once, twice, and settles. Its light paints the long wooden floor with gold that will vanish at dawn. Footsteps echo far down the gallery, a servant carrying clean linens, or a priest summoned for prayers that may already be too late. The shadows ripple to make room, and the gallery returns to its hush. If one were to listen closely, they might hear the heartbeat of this house deep in the walls, pulsing with secrets no monarch can bury for long. Tonight, the shadows stand guard along the corridor, stitched together by oil portraits and whispering wood beams. And far behind the closed doors, the king's breath rattles like wind through dry reeds. Each exhale a reminder that even a lion's roar can fade to nothing in a house that knows how to outlive its masters. In the king's chamber, the heavy velvet curtains stir as if alive, rising and falling with each gust of stale air that slips beneath the swollen window frames. The dusk outside has sunk into an ink-black hush, pressing its cold palm to the glass while the candles inside shudder in their brass holders. Each flame flickers like a restless memory, throwing soft, shifting shadows across the stone walls that have seen too much, yet never speak. Near the bed, the king lies cocooned under layers of brocade and fur, his swollen limbs swallowed by the great mattress that once bore the weight of a younger, fiercer man. Each labored breath drags at the fabric draped above him, drawing the curtains inward as if the chamber itself is trying to listen for that final gasp. The scent of old sweat and dried rosewater hangs thick in the folds, woven into every tassel and golden fringe. A maid kneels at the hearth, feeding the embers with thin sticks of kindling. She moves slowly, careful not to wake the wheezing sovereign whose eyelids flutter at visions only he can see. The soft crackle of the fire is the only sound that dares to break the hush, popping and sighing in a language older than any crown. She glances at the curtains, half expecting to see them reach for her with a ghostly hand. But they only sway, breathing in the same fevered air as the king. By the bedpost stands the physician, a weary man with ink-stained cuffs and fingers that tremble when they brush the king's damp brow. He pretends not to see the sores beneath the beard, the swelling that will not yield to poultices or prayers. His gaze flickers instead to the curtains, where the shadows cast strange shapes that shift in time with the monarch's rasping sighs. They remind him of the stories his mother once whispered, tales of curtains that swallow secrets, of hangings that listen at night when confessions slip loose. Swallow secrets, of hangings that listen at night when confessions slip loose. Rumor mills of London for generations is somewhere behind those hangings. A passage waits, a narrow artery of cold stone where servants creep unseen, their footfalls lost beneath the velvet hush. A single candle guttering on the writing desk throws just enough light to catch the edge of a letter half written, the ink pooling in an unfinished plea to God or counsel or fate. No one dares finish it now. To put pen to paper while the king still breathes would be to summon death in earnest. And so the quill lies dry, its tip stained with words that will never be spoken aloud. A soft cough breaks the silence. The priest by the window lifts his head, rosary clutched in his palm, so tightly the beads have left dents in his flesh. He watches the curtains move, imagines them swelling with every whispered prayer, every last confession that clings to the king's cracked lips. In the quiet, he hears the faint creak of floorboards beyond the chamber door, courtiers pacing in the gallery, boots scraping as they rehearse what must be said when the crown falls, who must bow, who must kneel. Closer to the bed, the curtains breathe again, rising just so before settling back against the carved posts. The king shifts, a low groan caught between dream and delirium. His mouth works at words that never quite form, scraps of names and oaths drifting up into the velvet canopy before sinking into the shadows. The maid dares not meet his eyes. She dips a cloth into lavender water, her fingers tracing the outline of his wrist, as if to keep him tethered here just a little longer. Beyond the glass, the frost has begun to crawl in thin, branching veins, etching lace-like patterns across the window. The wind outside keens low and soft, its voice slipping under the sill to swirl around the curtains. They swell outward this time, brushing the edge of the bed like a lover's parting touch. The king's breath rattles, deeper now, then shallow, then deep again. The rhythm of a man caught between a throne he cannot leave and a grave he cannot refuse. A hush falls so complete that the tick of the chamber clock becomes a hammering drum, echoing off the beams overhead. The physician presses 2 fingers to the king's neck, counting heartbeats that stutter and fade. The priest moves closer, words of absolution slipping from his cracked lips like warm milk into snow. For a moment, the curtains hold their breath. The entire room seems to bow inward, waiting for the final exhale that will unmake the king and turn him into something less than a man, more than a rumor. But the breath comes again, stubborn and thick, rattling through lungs that have forgotten how to serve him well. The curtains ease back, their folds settling against the bedpost as if disappointed by this brief reprieve. The maid dips her cloth once more. The fire pops in the grate. Somewhere far below, a bell chimes the hour, not quite dawn, not quite night. And the king's chamber dreams on, heavy with the smell of sickness and secrets. Its velvet curtains breathing for him when he cannot. In the hush that follows, the walls seem to whisper, "Not yet, not yet." In a low chamber beneath the king's rooms, where the chill seeps through the flagstones and the rushes lie damp underfoot, the plague doctor stands alone with his shadow. His mask, long-nosed and bird-like, rests on a stool beside him, its leather straps, it's cracked from years of service in alleys and sick rooms where the cries of the dying echo longer than any prayer. Here in the Tudor house, he waits in the hush, summoned not by plague but by the rot that clings to a king's bones when power refuses to let go. A single lantern swings above his head, its flame casting slow arcs of light across the vaulted ceiling. Dust drifts through the beam like pale ghosts, drawn to the heat they will never feel. He watches the moat swirl, his gloved hand drumming against the edge of a chipped table where vials of thick syrup and bundles of dried ribs lie, scattered among scraps of parchment. Each leaf of wormwood, each twist of rosemary, a talisman against a sickness no one dares name aloud. Outside this chamber, the royal bed creaks with the weight of a dying lion. Here, the hush feels older, closer to the ground where stone remembers the footfalls of plague carts, remembers the chant of monks who swung censers full of sweet smoke that never could keep death from finding its way in. He dips his fingers into a bowl of vinegar, the sting sharp through thin leather. Clean hands for a king who may never feel the touch. Clean hands for a corpse that must be carried without scandal. Near the hearth, a small brazier burns, sending up threads of bitter herbs that cling to the beams. A servant boy waits at the door, shoulders pressed to the frame, eyes darting to the mask on the stool. The boy has never seen it worn before, only heard the tales. How the beaked shadow walks the lanes when plague bells toll. How the street's empty when its shape drifts by. How no door is ever opened wide enough to invite it inside. The plague doctor lifts a vial to the lantern, turning it slowly until the syrup inside catches the glow. He wonders if the king's throat could swallow it now, if the bitter draught might buy a day, an hour, a heartbeat more. Yet he knows too well that no potion will cleanse royal blood so clogged with old sins and older wounds. He sets it down with care. The glass clink muffled by the hush that curls through this low chamber like a serpent, searching for warmth. Above, footsteps echo faintly, the shuffle of maids carrying linens. The guard's boots pacing outside a door that will soon swing wide for the last time. The plague doctor closes his eyes. He can almost feel the walls trembling with the weight of it all. The knowing that when a king's breath stills, the sickness does not die with him. It seeps through the mortar, slips into the servants' lungs, rides on the hems of cloaks as courtiers flee into the fog. He moves to the mask, lifting it by its cracked leather strap. The beak looms long and hollow, once packed with cloves and dried flowers to keep foul humors at bay. He brushes a thumb over its rim, the gesture softer than any seen by daylight. In the flicker of lantern glow, the hollow glass eyes stare back at him. Empty, yet full of every sigh and sob he has carried on his shoulders from house to house. The servant boy coughs once, the sound swallowed by the rushes underfoot. His small hand rubs at a scab on his wrist. The plague doctor studies him, imagines the boy's lungs blooming dark. If the sickness in the house is more than royal pride rotting from within, he thinks of his own mother, how she taught him to stuff the beak with lavender, how she wept into her apron when the black swellings came. He reaches for a sprig of rosemary, tucks it into the beak's hollow mouth, as if it matters now. Above, a door thuds shut. The sound of power shifting in wooden hinges, the sound of men deciding what tale will be told when dawn comes. The plague doctor slips the mask over his face, leather cold against his skin, breath echoing in the small chamber between bone and beak. He ties the straps, knotting them tight behind his head. The world becomes two small circles of glass, a muffled hush of linen rustling, fire crackling, boy's heartbeat skittering like a mouse behind plaster walls. In this moment, the mask is not fear but ritual, a promise to the house that no body will be left to swell and burst, that the corridors will not fill with flies come summer, a promise to the stone that the dead will be lifted, washed, wrapped, sent to rest before the hush grows so thick it cannot be scraped from the flagstones. He breathes once, twice. The herbs catch in his throat, sharp as knives. He reaches for the brazier, prodding the embers so the smoke coils up and around him, clinging to the stiff wool of his robe. The boy at the door bows his head, nose wrinkling at the bitter scent. Upstairs, a cough rattles through the floorboards, the king's final defiance against the hush. The plague doctor listens. Each breath is closer to silence, closer to the work he was called to do. In the dark, the mask's beak dips, small nod to the shadows that gather. When power seeps from flesh and bone into the waiting stone, he gathers his tools, the shears, the cloth, the vial of vinegar. His shadow moves behind him on the wall, beak and robe stretched tall by the lantern's sighing glow. Outside the chamber, the corridor waits, its cold floor, a path between sickness and the hush that must claim it. And above, the velvet curtains breathe again. The house draws the plague doctor's slow steps into its memory, adding his name to the many who have come and gone, who have carried secrets away in the beak of a mask, who have left behind nothing but the hush and the smell of bitter herbs clinging to the stones for years to come. Beyond the king's guarded chamber, the antechamber breathes its own tight hush, where the tapestry hangs heavy over the old oak door. A door that has felt the push of trembling hands and the scrape of desperate knuckles through the rain's long unraveling. On the velvet benches beneath it, courtiers gather like crows on a church roof. All hushed silks and hushed words, each pair of eyes darting to the door that might open on death at any moment. The tapestry droops in the torchlight, its hunting scene faded into shadows of stags and hounds forever caught in pursuit. It stirs when a draught leaks through the gap beneath the door, a breath of sickroom air that makes even the boldest noble flinch. They shift on their benches, adjusting cuffs, pulling rings loose and tight again, each gesture a quiet admission that power is slipping away through the cracks, carried on the rattle of a dying monarch's breath. A young lord leans close to an older man, his father, perhaps, or a patron whose purse strings have kept his boots clean and his future bright. They speak in words so soft, they melt into the rushes on the floor, glances flicking toward the tapestry as if it might part its woven trees to let the king's last moan slip through. The older man's hand trembles when he touches the signet on his finger, a mark of favor granted decades ago, when Henry's voice still boomed in the great hall and his laughter made lesser men quake. In the far corner, a lady in mourning black sits apart, veil pinned low, the hem of her gown brushing the damp stone. Her eyes never leave the tapestry's shifting folds. Some say she was cousin to the queen who lost her head. Others, that she is no one at all. A relic kept here to remind these men that a crown can be as sharp as any axe. Her fingers twist a rosary round and round, beads clicking like bones rolling across a wooden table. A page stands near the hearth, shoulders pressed tight to the carved mantle. He holds a silver ewer that has grown warm in his hands, its spout beaded with condensation. He does not meet the gaze of the nobles when they glance his way. Our servants' eyes are not meant to catch secrets in a place like this. Still his ears strain for every scrape of boot, every sigh that leaks through the tapestry's edge, each small betrayal of fear these lords cannot swallow. The hush thickens when a pair of physicians appear at the far door, cloaks dusted with the scent of herbs that cling to them like shadows. They exchange no pleasantries, only nods that crack open the silence a hair wider. One lifts the edge of the tapestry, peering past its velvet weight, as if the threads themselves might report what they've seen. He says nothing when he lowers it again, only lets out a breath that smells of cloves and despair. In the corridor behind them, a low murmur rises and falls. Servants ferrying bowls of water gone brown from washing a fevered brow. Scraps of linen soaked through with sweat and worse. The courtier's eyes follow each movement, each splash of footfalls on stone, measuring how close they stand to the moment when the door will swing open and the hush will break like a jug dropped on the paving. One man fidgets with a folded scrap of parchment, its seal half cracked. He reads it again and again by the flickering torch, lips moving in silence, as if the words might change if he watches long enough. They do not. The king lies dying beyond the tapestry, and the ink will not spare him. But the words hold a promise for the living. Alliances whispered behind rushes and walls. Fortunes waiting in the wings for the first man bold enough to step over the fallen lion's corpse. A draught slips under the tapestry again, cool and sour with the smell of sickness and the bitter trace of candle smoke. It stirs the hem of the lady's veil, draws a shudder from the youngest among them. Us, a boy who still wears a short sword too big for his hip. His eyes dart to the older lords, seeking some sign of courage in the way they cross their arms, the way they look away when the hush grows too deep. Outside the window, the gardens lie black and brittle, under a rim of frost. Each hedge and thorn a silent witness to the hours that slip by unnoticed. Somewhere in the orchard, a fox pads through frozen leaves, nose lifted to the scent of kitchen scraps and discarded bones. It pauses beneath the pale moon, ears twitching at the faint echo of a cough that rattles through the stones. Even the fox knows what the courtiers pretend not to know, that the hush beyond the tapestry will soon swallow a king and spit out a kingdom waiting to be torn apart. A distant bell tolls once, then twice. The lady's rosary beads catch the sound. Each click a heartbeat closer to the moment when the hunting scene will flutter. The door will open, and someone will step forward to claim a crown, still slick with the sweat of its last keeper. For now, they wait. They breathe the same sour air. They watch the tapestry swell with every whisper that seeps from the sick room. And in that hush, the old stones remember the countless feet that have stood here before. Boots damp with winter mud, slippers stained with tears. Velvet hems brushing the rushes while power shifts behind the velvet trees that hunt a stag no one ever catches. In a small withdrawing room tucked beside the gallery, a fire curls low in the grate, throwing its restless glow across the cracked stone hearth. A velvet cushion, deep green with gold tassels fraying at its corners, sits lonely on a narrow bench beneath the arched window. It looks harmless enough in the hush of this chamber, just another seat worn thin by the weight of noble backsides through decades of gossip and hushed confessions, but the cushion holds more than down and stuffing. Beneath its soft cover, secrets lie pressed flat as pressed herbs in a book of ours. A young maid stands nearby, her breath clouding the cold glass as she peers into the darkness of the garden below. She has heard the rumors, how the king once tucked letters, here when no other hiding place could keep them from the searching hands of his spies. Love notes from a queen whose head he later took, threats scratched in a trembling hand by some trembling advisor too wise to shout aloud what he feared, and later bribes folded small, promises scrawled by men who have long since vanished into the hush behind these walls. She steps away from the window, the frost clinging to her sleeves, and glances at the cushion. Her fingers hover over the velvet, tempted to press its softness to feel the promise of paper beneath her palm. Somewhere down the corridor, boots thud in uneven rhythm, a guard changing watch, or a courier slipping through the hush with another scrap of ink in fear. She listens until the steps fade, leaving only the pop of the fire to fill the hush. The maid lowers herself onto the bench, careful not to crush the shape hidden inside. She shifts her weight, feels the cushion's uneven heart give beneath her. There is something thrilling in the knowledge that she sits on secrets, that her slight body guards what might ruin a lord, or a lady, or perhaps even the dying king himself. She pictures the parchment, corners creased and smudged with the oil of frantic fingers. Words pressed tight as if the ink might fade if anyone speaks them aloud. She thinks of the last time she saw the king. A flicker of a man drowning in the vast bed, curtains breathing in and out with his labored sighs. They say he dreams now of hunting grounds and warm banquets, his mind wandering to those summer nights when his roar could silence every voice in the hall. But under the cushion rest words that once made him tremble. She wonders if he dreams of those too. If in his sleep he feels the scratch of parchment against his palm, the seal that breaks with the soft crack of betrayal. Outside the window, the orchard waits in brittle stillness. Branches creak under the weight of frost, and somewhere a barn owl calls once, then again, its cry drifting through the hush to nestle against the stones. The maid shifts again, her fingers brushing the frayed corner of the cushion. She wants to lift it, to slip the paper free and read each syllable by the glow of the hearth, to know who will kneel at the king's bedside when the last breath comes, and who will flee into the winter night with pockets lined in gold. But footsteps echo once more, this time closer, heavier, the steady tread of a man who wears his authority like a cloak too tight for his shoulders. The chamberlain pushes through the door, eyes sweeping the room before they settle on the maid. He does not look at the cushion, though she sees the flicker in his jaw, the brief knot of muscle that betrays his worry. He knows what lies under the velvet. Perhaps he tucked it there himself once, when the king demanded a place to humble for prying eyes. They exchange no words. The hush does not allow them. He lifts his hand, a signal as soft as the swirl of smoke rising from the hearth. She rises, smoothing her apron, careful not to press too hard against the cushion's hidden heart. The chamberlain lowers himself onto the bench, heavy robes rustling. His weight settles, and the secrets beneath him warm again with the heat of living flesh. A log collapses in the grate, sparks snapping like distant musket fire. Shadows crawl up the carved paneling, flickering over the chamberlain's face as he bows his head. His fingers find the seam at the cushion's side, feeling for the tiny slit that opens like a wound when coaxed. He does not draw out the parchment tonight. The moment has not come, not yet. The king still breathes, somewhere down the corridor, tangled in sweat-damp linens, and dreams of glory that rot at the edges. The maid lingers by the door, eyes lowered. She knows this dance, the way a secret is fed and starved at once. kept close enough to burn, yet far enough to deny, when dawn casts its pitiless light across the floor. She listens for the faint whisper of paper slipping against fabric, but hears only the hush, and the chamberlain's breath as steady as the tick of a hidden clock. Outside, the wind curls around the old walls, carrying with it the faintest trace of voices from the gallery where courtiers shift on velvet benches, their words catching like fishhooks in the darkness. Somewhere out there, a candle gutters on its wick, the hush waiting to claim it too. Beneath the cushion, the secrets keep their patient watch. Words that once stung the king's pride, bargains that might yet be worth their weight in crowns. The chamberlain's fingers rest atop the velvet, pressing just enough to remind him what waits beneath. He lets out a breath that curls white in the cold air, before rising, robes brushing the maid's skirt as he passes. When the door closes behind him, the hush returns. Thick, soft, it's unbroken, but for the whisper of the fire and the secrets that sigh beneath the cushion. Warm and restless in the shadows, waiting for a king to die. In the long corridor where the torchlight sputters against old tapestries, a servant stands alone. Back pressed to a panel of carved oak that once hid a passageway used by queens escaping unseen. His breath clouds the air, curls over the collar of his rough linen shirt, then fades into the hush that has settled over every flagstone of this house tonight. He is young, but his eyes are older than his bones. Eyes that have learned to see what must be carried and what must be left behind in the dark. It is midnight, though no bell dares toll it now. The king's life drags on behind closed doors, each ragged breath another stitch in the tapestry of power that will soon tear. The servant's gaze flickers to the end of the corridor where a single candle pools gold against the stone. A guard dozes on a bench, head tipped back against the wall, mouth open in the slack abandon of men who have learned to sleep while waiting for death to knock. In his hands, the servant holds a small basin, the water inside gone lukewarm hours ago. He does not dare return it yet. The order was given to stand ready, to fetch fresh cloths, to carry out soiled sheets when the king's coughing fits turn the chamber air foul. He shifts the basin from one palm to the other, feeling the cold seep into his bones, listening to the creak of wood beams far overhead. They groan with every draught, old ribs complaining as the house breathes in the last hours of its master's reign. He remembers the first time he saw the king, not as he lies now, bloated and bruised by sickness, but towering in a crimson doublet, in a goblet balanced in one meaty hand, while the other waved off every protest. He remembers the roar of laughter, the clink of gold rings against wine jugs, the way courtiers bent double with mirth when the king's temper pleased him. Now there is no roar, only the rasping hush of a man whose eyes roll back at shadows flickering above his canopy bed. The corridor stretches on behind him, a tunnel of woven scenes, hunts and coronations, triumphs stitched in wool by hands long turned to dust. The servant has traced these threads with his gaze so many times, he knows every stag, every drooping banner, every face half faded by candle smoke and centuries of damp. Tonight they look back at him like silent judges, reminding him that walls remember when tongues forget. He wonders what he will carry with him when dawn comes. If they will hand him a bundle of stained sheets, or a goblet the king's lips touched last. He knows servants who stole rings from cold fingers, who snipped locks of royal hair to sell in the back lanes for coin enough to flee London's plague-bloated streets. But his hands are empty but for the basin, the water lapping quietly as he shifts his weight from foot to foot. A soft scrape draws his gaze toward the far stairwell. Figure stands there now. A page, candle held high, eyes wide as if they might spill tears that no one will see. They trade no words. Their silence hangs thick in the corridor, threaded through with the faint echo of coughs that rattle down from the royal bedchamber above. The page nods once, an unspoken order. The servant dips his head, turns, and drifts away like smoke, the basin steady in his grasp. He moves through the shadows, feet careful not to disturb the hush that clings to every lintel and stone. His mind drifts back to the kitchens where he was born, to the scullery floor, to the days when his mother's hands scrubbed rushes and his father's back broke, lifting barrels of ale up the winding cellar steps. He wonders if they dreamed the same dreams that keep him awake now, of a day when a king's death might loosen the chains that bind men like him to the cold edges of these halls. The candlelight fades behind him as he rounds a corner. Here the stone underfoot grows colder. polished by centuries of slippered feet and soft shoes that carried secrets from ear to ear. He pauses by a small window, presses his forehead to the glass. The orchard below gleams silver under the moon, each tree a skeletal hand scratching at the sky. He imagines what it must feel like to stand out there, breath steaming into the dawn, no crowned shadow stretching long across his back. A muffled groan floats down the stairwell, the king calling for something he no longer has the strength to name. The servant closes his eyes. He listens to the hush, to the house remembering every birth, every betrayal, every final gasp that never really leaves the walls. Then he turns back to his steps, basin balanced, shoulders squared, eyes clear with the knowing that when the king dies, it will be his hands that carry away what remains of a lion's roar, drop by drop, cloth by cloth, until only the hush remains. The corridor swallows him whole. Just another shape moving through the shadows beneath the woven gaze of 1,000 huntsmen. Each arrow aimed at a prize that was never truly theirs to keep. And in this midnight hour, a servant's gaze drifts past secrets stitched in wool and stone, carrying them all where no torchlight can reach. In the long corridor where the torchlight sputters against old tapestries, a servant stands alone. Back pressed to a panel of carved oak that once hid a passageway used by queens escaping unseen, his breath clouds the air, curls over the collar of his rough linen shirt, then fades into the hush that has settled over every flagstone of this house tonight. He is young, but his eyes are older than his bones. Eyes that have learned to see what must be carried and what must be left behind in the dark. It is midnight, though no bell dares toll it now. King's life drags on behind closed doors, each ragged breath another stitch in the tapestry of power that will soon tear. The servant's gaze flickers to the end of the corridor, where a single candle pools gold against the stone. Guard dozes on a bench, head tipped back against the wall, mouth open in the slack abandon of men who have learned to sleep while waiting for death to knock. In his hands, the servant holds a small basin, the water inside gone lukewarm hours ago. He does not dare return it yet. The order was given to stand ready, to fetch fresh cloths, to carry out soiled sheets when the king's coughing fits turn the chamber air foul. He shifts the basin from one palm to the other, feeling the cold seep into his bones, listening to the creak of wood beams far overhead. They groan with every draught, old ribs complaining as the house breathes in the last hours of its master's reign. He remembers the first time he saw the king, not as he lies now, bloated and bruised by sickness, but towering in a crimson doublet,
Out a goblet.
balanced in one meaty hand while the other waved off every protest. He remembers the roar of laughter, the clink of gold rings against wine jugs, the way courtiers bent double with mirth when the king's temper pleased him. Now there is no roar, only the rasping hush of a man whose eyes roll back at shadows flickering above his canopy bed. The corridor stretches on behind him, a tunnel of woven scenes, hunts and coronations, triumphs stitched in wool by hands long turned to dust. The servant has traced these threads with his gaze so many times he knows every stag, every drooping banner, every face half-faded by candle smoke and centuries of damp. Tonight they look back at him like silent judges, reminding him that walls remember when tongues forget. He wonders what he will carry with him when dawn comes. If they will hand him a bundle of stained sheets, or a goblet the king's lips touched last. He knows servants who stole rings from cold fingers, who snipped locks of royal hair to sell in the back lanes for coin enough to flee London's plague-bloated streets. But his hands are empty but for the basin, the water lapping quietly as he shifts his weight from foot to foot. A soft scrape draws his gaze toward the far stairwell. A figure stands there now. A page, candle held high, eyes wide as if they might spill tears that no one will see. They trade no words. Their silence hangs thick in the corridor, threaded through with the faint echo of coughs that rattle down from the royal bedchamber above. The page nods once, an unspoken order. The servant dips his head, turns, and drifts away like smoke, the basin steady in his grasp. He moves through the shadows, feet careful not to disturb the hush that clings to every lintel and stone. His mind drifts back to the kitchens where he was born, to the scullery floor, to the days when his mother's hands scrubbed rushes and his father's back broke lifting barrels of ale up the winding cellar steps. He wonders if they dreamed the same dreams that keep him awake now, of a day when a king's death might loosen the chains that bind men like him to the cold edges of these halls. The candlelight fades behind him as he rounds a corner. Here, the stone underfoot grows colder, polished by centuries of slippered feet and soft shoes that carried secrets from ear to ear. He pauses by a small window, presses his forehead to the glass. The orchard below gleams silver under the moon, each tree a skeletal hand scratching at the sky. He imagines what it must feel like to stand out there, breath steaming into the dawn, no crowned shadow stretching long across his back. A muffled groan floats down the stairwell, the king calling for something he no longer has the strength to name. The servant closes his eyes. He listens to the hush, to the house remembering every birth, every betrayal, every final gasp that never really leaves the walls. Then he turns back to his steps, basin balanced, shoulders squared, eyes clear with the knowing that when the king dies, it will be his hands that carry away what remains of a lion's roar, drop by drop, cloth by cloth, until only the hush remains. The corridor swallows him whole. Just another shape moving through the shadows beneath the woven gaze of 1,000 huntsmen. Each arrow aimed at a prize that was never truly theirs to keep. And in this midnight hour, a servant's gaze drifts past secrets stitched in wool and stone, carrying them all where no torchlight can reach. Above the chambers and galleries where courtiers pace in muffled dread, the attic crouches beneath the eaves like an old hound watching its master's final breath. Dust coats every beam, a soft blanket for the forgotten trunks and chests stacked like coffins beneath the sloped roof. Cobwebs drift in the lantern glow, catching motes of straw and hair. And sometimes, when the wind rattles the leaded panes, they shiver like the ghosts who never quite leave this house. A servant girl climbs the narrow stair tonight, skirts brushing the wood that creaks its protest at her weight. She has come for fresh linens, the good ones hoarded up here in cedar chests bound with iron hinges. Her hands tremble on the lantern's handle, a thin flame flickering across her face as she glances into every corner where the dark gathers thickest. They say the attic is haunted by voices, by the sighs of queens who wept under the axe, by the hush of secrets sewn into petticoats and hidden behind loose boards. She sets the lantern on an old oak barrel, breathes into her cold palms. The hush up here is different from the hush below. In the king's chamber, silence carries the weight of sickness and the stale scent of rosewater masking rot. Here, the hush is dry and restless, rustling in the straw, brushing the rafters where pigeons once nested before they were bricked out by some forgotten order. The girl can almost hear them still, wings beating above her head like the frantic heart in her chest. She lifts the lid of the first chest, its hinges complaining with a low moan that echoes between the beams. Inside, linens lie folded stiff with starch, embroidered with the Tudor rose and thread the color of dried blood. Her fingers trace the stitchwork, feeling each petal raised under her thumb. She wonders who sewed them, which pale girl sat by candlelight, pushing needle through linen, while the king's footsteps thundered on the floors below. She wonders if that girl left part of her soul behind in every thread. A whisper brushes her ear. She jerks her head up, breath caught in her throat. There is no one here, only the shadows hunched between the trunks and the slow drip of water from a cracked tile overhead. She listens, heart racing, but hears nothing more than the attic's own shallow breath. Somewhere under her feet, the king's rattling cough stutters in the hush, then sinks again into the depths of the stone walls. She gathers an armful of sheets, their white folds draping over her wrists like a bride's veil. The fabric smells faintly of lavender gone stale, its sweetness buried beneath the dry scent of cedar and dust. She pauses by an old wardrobe, its doors half open, revealing a row of moth-eaten gowns that belonged to a queen whose name no one speaks unless the fire is low and the shutters drawn tight. The sleeves sway as if stirred by a hand that cannot rest. She remembers the tales the older maids tell, how the queen's ghost wanders these beams. Face hidden behind a veil of linen, hands pressed to the boards where her last letters were hidden from the king's spies. They say that if you stand too long by the wardrobe, you'll hear her breath behind your shoulder, whispering questions no living soul can answer. Tonight, the servant girl feels that hush press close, the attic's shadows leaning in to brush her cheek with the chill of secrets best left to the dark. A sudden draft rattles the panes. Dust drifts from the rafters, drifting into her hair. She shivers, hugging the bundle of linens tighter, as if the thin fabric might guard her from the hush that remembers everything. Somewhere near the eaves, a mouse darts across the floorboards, its tiny claws clicking a path through straw and splinters. Its presence comforts her somehow, proof that something still lives here, something that does not care for kings or queens or ghosts stitched into the mortar. She lifts the lantern again, its glow trembling, as she picks her way back toward the narrow stair. Her shoes scuffed, old boards polished smooth by centuries of servants come and gone, each one carrying secrets in their quiet steps. She thinks of the king, gasping behind velvet curtains that breathe in and out like lungs. She thinks of the chamberlain pacing below, the maids wringing cloths in bowls of rosewater, the courtiers pressed close to the tapestry door, their ears straining for the final word that will change the world by dawn. The attic watches her pass, its hush closing in behind like a door swinging gently on ancient hinges, keeps its whispers folded into the trunks, stitched into the hem of forgotten gowns, hidden between the pages of letters that were never burned. And when the last monarch takes his final breath below, the attic will sigh with him, an exhale that drifts through every rafter, every beam, until the hush settles again, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to climb these stairs alone. She steps into the stairwell, linens pressed tight to her chest. The lanterns glow trailing shadows behind her like pale ghosts tumbling into the dark. And the haunted attic, cold and waiting, closes its eyes once more, cradling its secrets in the hush that outlives every king. In the far corner of the king's private solar, where the scent of spent candles clings to the velvet drapes, the old Tudor clock ticks its slow, uncertain rhythm. Its face, carved from dark oak and set with brass filigree, stares blankly at the hush that pools around the bedchamber door. Its hands crawl forward, then catch, then slip, as if time itself is reluctant to keep pace with the king's breath rattling just beyond the wall. A young steward stands watch beside it, shoulders pressed against the cold paneling, his fingers drumming on the table where the clock sits among scraps of parchment and an untouched plate of bread gone hard as stone. He cannot remember a night when the clock has kept true time. Its gears grind like old bones, its pendulum stutters when the wind rattles the windows. Yet no one dares silence it, as though its halting voice is the last promise that the house still holds its heartbeat steady, even while the king's does not. Each tick spills into the hush, measured out between the creak of a floorboard in the corridor and the soft hiss of logs shifting in the hearth. The steward's eyes drift to the window, where frost flowers bloom on the panes, catching the torchlight from the courtyard below. He thinks of the men stationed out there, breath pluming in the cold, while they guard doors that will soon open to a corpse wearing a crown heavier than any sword. He reaches for the key that winds the clock, turns it slowly, careful not to snap the ancient teeth inside. The key scrapes, a sound too loud for a house so quiet, and he glances over his shoulder as if the shadows might rebuke him for waking them. The minute hand shudders forward, then halts again, a stubborn protest against the dawn that must come. There are stories that the clock was gifted to Henry by a foreign prince, its inner workings blessed by monks to mark the king's hours with mercy. But mercy rarely lingers in this house. Some say it ticks backward at times, carrying whispered curses through the gears and cogs, spinning secrets into the hush so that the walls remember them long after voices fade. The steward wipes a smear of grease from his thumb onto his sleeve, then settles his palm on the clock's rounded crown. It feels warm from the candle stubs flickering beside it. He wonders how many times this small, stubborn heartbeat has outlasted the people who wound it. How many kings, how many queens, how many servants stood just so, waiting for the hands to align with the hush that follows a final breath. From the chamber beyond the door comes a muffled cough, the king again, clawing at the edges of sleep, chasing a memory or a regret he can no longer name. The sound is raw, tearing through the hush like a blade dragged across wet parchment. The steward flinches, eyes darting to the pendulum that swings and stutters, as if echoing that ragged gasp. In the corner, a mouse emerges from a crack beneath the paneling, nose twitching at the crumbs littering the steward's table. It pauses beneath the clock, whiskers brushing the brass feet. The steward does not shoo it away. He imagines the small creature listening to the same halting beat, its tiny heart thrumming in time with the uneven ticks, both of them caught in the hush of a dying rain. The hearth crackles once, sending a wisp of smoke curling into the beams overhead. Shadows flicker across the tapestry on the opposite wall, a hunting scene. frozen forever in the moment before the hounds close their jaws around a stag too proud to run. The steward wonders if the king dreams of hunts like that, if in his fevered sleep he is young again, muscles taut, laughter echoing through the forest, while the clock back at court counts each heartbeat, each hoofbeat, each lie told to keep the crown from slipping. Another tick, another catch. The hands quiver, 1 minute folding into the next like a secret passed from mouth to mouth. The steward leans closer, ear nearly brushing the clock's face. In that hush, he thinks he can hear more than gears and cogs. Thinks he can hear the words of old prayers trapped behind the brass. The names of the king's enemies, the final confessions of wives, whose last sighs never quite faded. He straightens, the key still warm in his palm. The hush folds around him once more, pressing soft and heavy against his ribs. Somewhere in the hall outside, a pair of courtiers exchange low words. Their voices too muffled to carry meaning, but sharp enough to slip beneath the door and wedge themselves in his mind. He closes his eyes, feels the clock tick again. Uneven, uncertain, yet faithful in its own faltering way. The steward knows that when the hush breaks, when the door creaks wide and the king lies still at last, the clock will tick on. It will mark the heartbeat of a house that outlives its masters, its hands grinding forward no matter whose head wears the crown. He gives the key one last careful turn, then sets it aside, fingers brushing the worn wood as if to promise that he will return tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, as long as there is breath to be measured, secrets to be kept, and the hush of stone walls waiting to hold them all. In the deepest hush before dawn, when the hearth's embers sink low, and the torchlight in the gallery gutters out one by one, the priest walks the flagged corridor toward the king's chamber. His robes, heavy with incense and the faint salt of old sweat, brush the stone like the whisper of a moth's wings. Each step carries the weight of prayers never quite enough to mend what power breaks. His breath curls in the chill that leaks through the arrow-slit windows, yet his lips keep moving. Silent Latin, scraps of psalm words stitched together like frayed linen. He pauses at a door half ajar, candlelight pooling in a slender band across the rushes. Inside, a servant kneels at a low table, folding cloths still damp from washing the king's sores. The priest's eyes rest on the boy's bowed head, the curve of his spine, the quiet surrender of it all. He remembers his own boyhood, the cold floors of the monastery, the bite of a rod across knuckles when prayers faltered. He knows the hush of stone better than any warmth of hearth or flesh. When the boy glances up, eyes wide and rimmed red, the priest lifts 2 fingers in blessing, a promise that means nothing, yet carries everything these walls can hold. The boy returns to his cloths. The door drifts shut. The corridor swallows the rustle of linen, and the hush drifts back around the priest's shoulders like a cowl. Ahead, the king's chamber door looms, heavy with carvings of angels, who have never watched close enough. Beneath its seam, a thin line of candlelight flickers against the stone. He stands before it a moment, fingertips brushing the rough grain, as if he might feel the heartbeat behind it, that slow, ragged thrum of breath trapped beneath velvet hangings and layers of fur that do nothing now but hold in the smell of sickness. He steps inside. The hush inside the room is thicker, shaped by the slow exhale of a dying king. Curtains hang from the 4-post bed, folds stirring with every shallow rise of the monarch's chest. The fur coverlet has slipped from one shoulder, exposing flesh waxen and flushed with a fever no relic or holy water can chase away. A single candle burns on the bedside table, its flame wavering each time the king gasps and sighs. The priest crosses himself, words still murmured under breath. He sets his leather-bound psalter on a low stool and kneels beside the bed, knees sinking into the rushes that smell faintly of lavender laid down to mask the scent of rot. His eyes flick to the king's face. The eyes half-lidded, mouth parted around words that never find shape. So many words in this life, the priest thinks, and now not one left that can be heard by any but God. A physician hovers on the other side, cloth in hand, dabbing at the damp hair, clinging to the king's brow. He nods to the priest, eyes sunken from hours of watching this slow unraveling. Their gazes meet, 2 men bound by the same helpless hush. No more poultices, no more herbs, no more prayers whispered into a monarch's ear. when the breath has already begun to drift from flesh to stone. The priest's fingers move across the beads at his wrist, the rosary a quiet counterpoint to the irregular rattle of the king's chest. He leans forward, lips near the monarch's ear, and whispers absolution in a voice so soft it feels woven into the curtains themselves. Latin words slip into the folds of velvet, into the canopy overhead, into the hush that gathers beneath the bed where rats stir at the scent of a failing heart. A log shifts in the hearth, sparks flaring just enough to cast a new shape across the walls. The priest lifts his head, eyes tracing the flicker of shadows dancing over portraits that hang in solemn witness. He wonders how many kings have passed this way, how many queens have pressed a cold kiss to a brow that would soon know only dirt. He wonders how many ghosts stand behind him now, listening for the last words that will bind the soul to whatever waiting comes next. Outside the chamber, the corridor creaks with a servant's cautious step. Hush returns, before the sound can settle, pressing thick as wool around the king's wheezing breath. The priest leans closer, lips near the monarch's ear once more. He speaks of mercy, though he doubts the man can hear. He speaks of forgiveness, though he knows too well how sin clings to these stones long after flesh has turned to dust. When the king shifts, the priest's hand trembles on the bedframe, not from fear, but from the weight of words he will carry away when dawn finally presses its pale palm to the frost-trimmed windows. He knows the moment is near. He feels it in the hush, in the way the candle guttered once, then righted itself as if reluctant to abandon its flame before the breath beside it gives out. He does not close his psalter when he rises. He leaves it open on the stool, pages fluttering with the draft that leaks through the shuttered windows, promise unfinished, prayers still waiting to be heard. He crosses himself again, fingers brushing the cold of the king's wrist before he retreats. His steps echo soft and slow as he passes beneath the carved arch into the corridor where the hush waits to fold him back into its cold embrace. And behind him, in the small flicker of candlelight, the king's breath drifts on, thinner now. More ghost than man, wrapped in the soft whisper of a priest's footsteps that will carry his last confession down the long stone corridor, into the waiting hush that remembers every secret word spoken in the shadow of the crown. In a chamber that feels miles from the king's stifling sick room, yet is bound to it by every breath, the queen sits awake beside a hearth gone nearly cold. Her gown, heavy with dark embroidery, pools around her feet in restless folds that catch the candlelight and swallow it whole. She holds no rosary, no parchment letter, nothing at all but the hush pressing against her throat, thick as wool, tight as a promise unkept. The fire has burned to ash but for one stubborn coal that flickers when the wind creeps through the shutter. Its glow throws her shadow against the wall, a long, bent shape that does not match the woman who once walked these halls with her chin lifted, sleeves brushing the tapestries as she greeted each courtier with a smile, too careful to be trusted. Tonight, there is no one to see her bare neck, no one to catch the way her fingers twist the folds of her skirt, as if searching for words she cannot say aloud. She remembers the night they told her of the fever, how the physician bowed so low he nearly vanished into the rushes, how the candle by her elbow quivered when the word rot slipped into the hush between them. They speak to her now only when they must. Short nods, courtesies, stripped of meaning. The king's chamber door has become a wall no crown can breach. What could her presence do for him now? They whisper, when they think she does not hear, except remind him of every promise broken, every child that never lived to inherit his name. A maid enters with a fresh taper, eyes downcast. She lights it with trembling hands, the new flame catching the queen's profile for an instant, cheek hollowed by worry, eyes rimmed in the purple bloom of sleepless nights. She does not look up, does not thank the girl, only watches the wick bend toward the hearth's last coal until the light steadies. When the maid slips out again, the hush settles thicker, wrapping itself around the queen's shoulders like a shawl that cannot warm her. She rises then, feet whispering across the flagstones. At the far wall hangs a small portrait, no bigger than her palm, a likeness of her child, face that never grew beyond its first spring. She touches the edge of the frame, fingertip brushing dust from the painted cheek. There is grief here that the courtiers will never speak of, grief she does not name even in her own prayers. The child gone, the marriage twisted by years of bruising silences, the kingdom balanced on a dying man's breath. She imagines the king in his grand bed, mouth open like a gaping wound, breath rattling through lungs too tired to hold it. She tries to summon pity, tries to remember the warmth that once flickered between them like a flame that could outlast every draft. But the hush reminds her that power and tenderness rarely share the same bed for long. She stands very still, letting the hush tell her what it knows. That kings die, crowns tarnish, and the walls keep secrets longer than any wedding vow. A wind slips through the shutter again, rattling the latch. She crosses the room and presses her palm to the cold wood, feeling the tremor of the house beneath her skin. Somewhere beyond the gardens, the Thames glides black under the moon, carrying whispers toward London's narrow lanes. She wonders if they already speak her name in the taverns, wondering if she will keep her title, when the hush beneath the king's ribs becomes final. Behind her, the candle flutters once, the flame bowing low. She turns, skirts sighing against the floor, and moves back to the hearth where her chair waits, its cushion indented from hours of silent vigil. She sits, folding her hands in her lap, eyes locked on the coal that glows and dims, glows and dims. She does not pray. There is no prayer that will untangle what years have knotted tight. Outside her door, a page hovers in the corridor, boots scuffing the stone in nervous circles. He will knock when the time comes, voice trembling as he bows too low, telling her what she already knows. That the breath is stilled. That the hush has swallowed the last roar of a lion whose teeth grew dull before his heart gave out. Until then, she waits. The hush settles into her bones, wraps itself around the memory she does not speak. Not even to the cold walls that know her grief better than any confessor. The candle trembles, the coal sighs its last red breath. The queen's eyes drift to the shuttered window,
and in that hush,
where frost
grief
blossoms
breathes
in delicate
quiet,
petals
unseen,
along the glass, unspoken, waiting to slip through the cracks of the stone and linger long after the kingdom finds. Its new voice far beyond the palace walls, where the king's final breath unravels in. The hush of heavy curtains and stale rosewater, an old stone monastery sits among fields gone barren with winter's frost. Its arches sag with centuries of kneeling. Its cloisters cradle prayers whispered by voices long turned to dust. Yet tonight, in the hush of the king's slow dying, this distant place hums in memory behind the eyes of an aging monk who once tended the monarch's soul. When that soul was still light enough to lift, he kneels in a small cell, its walls whitewashed and cracked, the rushes beneath him sharp with cold that seeps up through his knees. A single candle flickers near his folded hands, its flame steady, as if defying the wind that pushes at the shuttered window. Outside, the courtyard lies empty, save for the prince of sparrows hopping through powdery snow. No bells toll tonight. No voices echo down the cloisters. Only the hush of stone remembering. He thinks of the king as he was, a youth who rode into the monastery with banners snapping above him. Laughter booming across the refectory when he demanded fresh loaves and honeyed ale. How bright his eyes then, how restless his hands that never stilled, not even during confession. The monk remembers the weight of that young head bowed under the hush of a wooden cross. Words of penance murmured with a half-smile, because he knew. Even then, that power could absolve what no priest ever could. He murmurs prayers now with that same hush stitched to his tongue. They drift across the cell like the smoke from the candle, curling into the beams overhead where ghosts gather to listen. He imagines the king's breath catching behind velvet curtains, imagines the cold fingers brushing a priest's sleeve. In the stifled hush of the royal bedchamber, he knows that when that final breath comes, the hush will spread, slipping under doors, settling on every tapestry, finding its way into the hearts of men who claim to serve God and crown alike. He bows lower, forehead pressed to his knuckles, eyes closed tight against the flicker of the candle. He thinks of the orchard behind the monastery wall, how he once walked there with the young king, boots squelching in spring mud. How the boy had asked if a soul could be washed clean with enough prayers, if a crown made the stain deeper. Da-da! Monk had no answer then. He has none now. Only the hush knows, and the hush will not speak. A breeze pushes through the shutter's loose board, making the flame shudder. The cold slips around the edges of his robe, settling into the hollows of his collarbones, the brittle joints of his fingers. He lifts his head and traces the old stones with his gaze, stones smoothed by centuries of fingers brushing them on their way to the altar. The walls know the sins confessed here, betrayals whispered at dawn, ambitions coughed out with blood and tears. They know the king's name better than any psalter does, each syllable folded into their mortar like bones into earth. He rises slowly, bones creaking louder than the wind's soft breath through the shutter. He moves to the narrow window and pushes it open a finger's width. Outside, the fields stretch under the moon's thin eye, rows of stubbled stalks shining silver. Orchard trees standing bare-limbed and waiting for spring. Hush drifting this far, riding on the river that slips past the palace and winds its way toward the monastery wall. He imagines the king's secrets settling on the garden beds, sinking into the roots to bloom again when warmth returns. In the corridor beyond his cell, another monk stirs. Sandaled feet shuffle over cold flagstones, the sound no louder than a heartbeat. They will meet at the chapel soon, gather near the altars, flickering candles, to sing the night prayers for a soul that once ruled their land with the certainty of thunder.
Out.
There will be no grand requiem here, no crowns or velvet drapes, only the hush of stone and candlelight, and the chant of voices asking mercy for a man who built kingdoms on the bones of those who bent to his will. He closes the shutter, leaving the cold locked outside. The candle flickers once more, a thin tongue aflame against the dark. He lifts the psalter from the floor, fingers brushing the worn leather where so many prayers have left the cover soft as linen. He knows the words by heart, knows how they taste on the tongue when the hush grows thick and the night presses in too close. And as he kneels once more, the hush of the stone monastery folds around him, a hush that remembers the young kings. Laughter, the press of his forehead against a wooden cross, the way his sins poured out like spilled wine across a chapel floor. In that hush, the monk prays not for absolution, but for a dawn soft enough to carry the king's breath away, leaving behind only the hush that stones keep long after every crown has crumbled to dust. Deep, in a small chamber off the long gallery, where the walls are hung with tapestries too faded to name their kings and saints. A scroll lies curled beside the hearth, half hidden under a tangle of firewood stacked for the night. The parchment is brittle at its edges, its wax seal cracked. Where careless hands brushed it aside, no one speaks of it now. No one dares to lift it from its resting place. Though many eyes drift to that small shadow when the flames burn low and the hush grows thick enough to taste. A clerk sits by the fire tonight, shoulders hunched inside, a threadbare cloak he borrowed from a guard too tired to protest. His ink-stained fingers hover near the warmth, though they never stray close to the scroll. He knows it is there, the weight of it pressing at his mind like a stone under water. He remembers how it came into his hands, a messenger shivering. From the cold, boots muddy from the river road, pressing the wax into his palm with words that slipped through the hush before he could catch them whole. The fire pops, single spark leaping up to kiss the soot-blackened chimney. He watches the scroll shift when a draft slips through the hall. Its edges lift and settle again, a ghost of a gesture, as if the parchment itself might unroll, if only the hush would let it. He imagines the words inside, words that could shift, the weight of gold from one hand to another, that could unravel a promise made beneath a canopy when the king's voice still carried like thunder. The clerk has read it once. By the flicker of a single candle when the rest of the house lay pinned, under the hush of sleep, he read the names, the sums, the places where coin should pass from merchant to noble, noble to crown, crown to pockets, no one will claim come dawn. Why? He saw the small marks in the margins, notations pressed in a hand he has copied too many times, to mistake the king's own, ragged now. The ink dragged by a wrist that trembled even then. Yet here it rests, near the fire's reach. Not burning, not hidden away behind the panels where other secrets have gone to rot in the dark. He wonders who meant for it to be found, or forgotten, or both. The hush does not answer.
Oh.
It only presses closer when the wind moans through the high chimney, stirring the embers in a slow sigh that shivers through the clerk's bones. Behind him, footsteps drift down the gallery, the light scrape of velvet slippers, the muffled tread of boots, too fine for a servant, does not turn. The hush in the corridor belongs to the ones who trade glances by the king's chamber door, who weigh their fortunes in each ragged gasp the king draws. If they see the scroll by the fire, they do not stoop to claim it. They know some truths are best left to smolder until the flames swallow them whole. The clerk leans forward, palms splayed above the warmth. He thinks of the ledger waiting at his desk, pages that must be copied before dawn, names that must be inked true even as the truth itself blackens like paper tossed to a spark. He thinks of the king upstairs, his voice gone soft as soot, words slipping loose in dreams that bind him tighter to the hush than any crown ever could. A log settles in the grate. It shifts, sending a burst of orange light across the stone. For a heartbeat, the scroll is bathed in that glow, the broken seal glistening like blood clotted dry, the parchment edges curling tighter in the warmth that never quite touches its heart. He feels the pull of it, the ache to lift it once more, to smooth it across his knee and read what the hush has tried so long to swallow. But his hand does not move. Some secrets are better left for the flames, in the shadows behind him. The tapestry stirs as if something breathes within its threads. A hunter forever caught in the moment before his arrow flies, a stag's eyes wide with knowing. He thinks of all the names stitched into the weft of this house, queens who walked the gallery barefoot in the hush of night, bishops who muttered bribes in Latin, scribes who tucked damning words behind panels, only to see them dragged into fire years later. The clerk rises at last, knees stiff from hours of listening to the hush coil itself around his shoulders. He does not glance at the scroll again. He steps away from the hearth, boots silent on the rushes, leaving behind the crackle of flames that creep closer with every shifting log. The hush follows him down the gallery, slipping into the folds of his cloak, nestling in the space between. His heartbeat and the memory of ink and wax. When the final spark catches, it will do so quietly, no grand blaze to light the rafters, no cry to rouse the dozing guard. Only a slow curling of parchment into ash, words unmade in the hush that waits for all secrets to be given up in their time. And the fire, faithful and slow, will remember what the crown could not. Near the king's bed, where the hush clings so thick, he remembers the king's voice when it still rolled like thunder down the corridors that roar demanding more wine. More game, more favors squeezed from every man who dared stand close enough to feel the spit of his rage. He remembers the first time he pressed his fingers to the royal wrist, counting a pulse that drummed so strong he felt it echo through his own bones. Now the pulse is a whisper under swelling flesh, a trickle of life that slips further with every ragged exhale. Behind him, a maid dabs the king's brow with a strip of linen dipped in rose water gone stale. She does not look at the physician. She knows better than to catch his eye, better not to see what he sees when he glances at the sores that never heal. The bruises blooming like ink beneath the king's ribs. Her hands move gently, the hush, cradling the wet cloth like a relic pressed to a holy brow. He lifts a bottle, watches the dark liquid slide along the glass. He wants to believe in it, the potion mixed with trembling hands in the hours before dawn, herbs plucked from the palace gardens where frost now webs the hedgerows. He wants to believe that one more swallow might buy an hour, a heartbeat, chance for the king to open his eyes and speak a word that would bind the hush back behind the tapestries where secrets belong. But when he steps closer to the bed, king's lips part in a moan too thin to hold sense. His tongue lolls against cracked teeth. The physician sees the way the king's eyes flicker at shadows on the canopy overhead, chasing ghosts who come to claim their debts. He imagines each breath as a coin dropped into the hush, the final wealth of a body that once believed itself, too vast to fall. His fingers tremble worse now, the bottle knocking gently against the rim of the cup. He braces his wrist with his other hand, but the hush makes the small sound echo. a hollow tap that seems to rattle through the carved bedposts and the heavy drapes that billow when the king's lungs hitch for air. He lifts the cup to the royal mouth, tips it just so, watches a dribble slide past the king's chin into the folds of the pillow. There is no protest. There's no roar. The lion's throat, once thick with feasts and boasts, opens only to let slip a breath sour with decay. The physician wipes the spill with the edge of his sleeve, as if the stain might shame him more than the truth it reveals. That nothing in the bottles will hold back the hush. Not this night. Not ever. In the corner of the room, the priest shifts. On his knees, voice murmuring low as beads slide through his fingers. He does not look at the physician. He does not have to. They both feel the same chill, the same waiting. Outside, the orchard trees scratch at the walls, bare branches ticking. Against the leaded glass-like fingers tapping to be let in, the physician sets the bottle down too quickly. It clinks against its brother vials, glass chattering like teeth in the draft that slips through the curtains. He flexes his hands, rubs his palms together, tries to rub the tremor out of his skin. He thinks of the scrolls stacked in his study, all the recipes and cures inked by candlelight, the borrowed words of men who once claimed that nature can be forced to yield its secrets if only one crushes the right route, boils the right bark, says the right prayer. But here in this hush, beneath the canopy of a bed that has held too many final breaths, the secrets stay locked tight. The hush feeds on them, folds them into the stone, so they linger in the mortar long after the last vial has dried. A breath catches the king's throat, working once, twice. The physician leans close, lips parted as if to speak, but no word. Comes. His hand hovers over the coverlet, fingers splayed as if he might press the life back through the king's fevered skin. Instead, the hush takes the sound of that final raking sigh and tucks it deep into the corners of the velvet drapes. He lowers his head. His hands fall to his sides. They shake still, not from the cold, but from the knowing that no draught or potion can hold back what the hush has always owned. Somewhere in the hallway, footsteps pause just outside the door, a page waiting for the word that must come. But for now, the hush holds its breath, letting the last flicker of a royal pulse slip from the physician's trembling hands into the stones, where the secrets of kings belong. Down the corridor where the torchlight flickers dull against centuries of soot, the great stair waits wide enough for a king's hunting party to thunder down to abreast, narrow enough now to trap. The hush between each stone tread like breath caught behind a dying man's teeth. The hush holds its place here, curling under the carved balustrade, sliding beneath the boots of the men who hover near the top landing, heads bent, words caught in their throats before they dare break the spell of waiting. Tonight the hush carries the weight of heavy boots. One by one, courtiers pace its curve, spurs catching the flicker of torchlight, keels striking the stone in rhythms too steady for a house that knows its master's heart stutters in the room above. A steward, his cloak dusted with cinders from the hearth, shifts his weight from step to step. His hand drags along the polished rail, fingertips tracing the grooves worn by years of hands slick with sweat and secrets. Below, near the foot of the stair, a guard leans against the great door that opens to the garden court. His boots, broad and scarred by seasons spent stamping mud from the fields, leave prints on the rushes scattered across the flags. He lifts one foot, then the other, rolling the ache from his soles, the hush of his breath rising in pale puffs, before dissolving into the draught that creeps along the ground. He remembers the stories, how these stairs once trembled under the stomp of the king's fury, how laughter rang down from the gallery when the royal boots crossed the threshold, and lesser men flattened themselves against the walls to let power pass. A flicker of memory stirs at the landing. A young page lingers 2 steps below the steward, chin tucked into the collar of his doublet, eyes fixed on the hush that drips from the top of the stair like candle wax. He has never seen the king awake, only glimpses of a broad hand reaching for the goblet, the shifting mass of velvet curtains pulled close against the smell of ointments. Yet tonight he knows the echo of those boots. He knows how the hush eats each step, dulling the thud until it feels like walking through wool soaked in secrets. A door creaks open above. Leather soles scrape against the stone landing. The quiet. Hush shivering with the faint sound of fabric dragging over rushes. A physician emerges first, head lowered, face pale as parchment. The hush clinging to the hem of his coat like a final confession. He does not speak. His boots find the edge of the top step, hesitate, then drift down. Each tread creaking in the hush that holds the house tight in its throat. Behind him, the chamberlain appears. His boots are newer, calfskin polished by a servant's hand, until the toe gleams, even in the dying light of the torch. He carries the hush with him like a cloak. Each step measured so the creak of the stair does not betray what has already been decided behind the heavy door. His eyes flick to the steward, to the page, to the guard waiting in the shadow below. No words pass his lips. He holds them tight behind his teeth, like a coin that must not be spent until the right ear leans close. The steward shifts his boots, leather soles squeaking just enough to make the hush snap around him like a curtain drawn too quickly. He wants to speak, to ask if the king has spoken, if the final sigh was caught by the priest's waiting ear, but the hush presses the words back down his throat. He swallows them, letting them sink like stones into his belly, and nods instead. The page sees it, feels the weight of that silent nod echo down into his slippers, small and soft beside the heavy boots that mark the stair with scuffs too deep for any rushes to cover. Below, the guard crosses one boot over the other, planting himself at the base of the stair like a door that will not open without a fight. He watches the chamberlain descend, eyes wide at the glimpse of the sealed scroll, clutched tight against the man's chest. The boots pass him by, each step pressing the hush deeper into the flagstones, burying the last roar of a monarch somewhere. Between the fourth and fifth tread, where a blood stain still hides under layers of sand and candle ash, somewhere far above, the hush still breathes in the king's chamber, velvet curtains, fluttering once more around the hollow of a bed too vast, now for the small gasp of breath that rattled there moments ago. The boots carry that hush down the stair. Each step, an echo of the heartbeat that failed in the dark. No one speaks when they reach the ground. The hush has already told them everything they need to know. The guard shifts his boots again, settles his spear against the wall. The page presses himself. Back into the shadows, slippers silent as the flick of a mouse's tail. The steward turns his gaze toward the crack under the great door, where the wind rattles the frost on the panes and the hush leaks out into the gardens that wait for a dawn, now freed from its king, and the boots. The heavy boots stand still. At last, on the flagstone floor, a hush gathering at their heels like a rumor too old for any man's tongue, yet true enough to outlive every footfall that ever dared cross these stairs. He remembers the king's voice when it still rolled like thunder down the corridors that roared demanding more wine. More game, more favors squeezed from every man who dared stand close enough to feel the spit of his rage. He remembers the first time he pressed his fingers to the royal wrist, counting a pulse that drummed so strong he felt it echo through his own bones. Now the pulse is a whisper under swelling flesh, a trickle of life that slips further with every ragged exhale. Behind him, a maid dabs the king's brow with a strip of linen dipped in rose water gone stale. She does not look at the physician. She knows better than to catch his eye, better not to see what he sees when he glances at the sores that never heal. The bruises blooming like ink beneath the king's ribs. Her hands move gently, the hush, cradling the wet cloth like a relic pressed to a holy brow. He lifts a bottle, watches the dark liquid slide along the glass. He wants to believe in it, the potion mixed with trembling hands in the hours before dawn, herbs plucked from the palace gardens where frost now webs the hedgerows. He wants to believe that one more swallow might buy an hour, a heartbeat, a chance for the king to open his eyes and speak a word that would bind the hush back behind the tapestries where secrets belong. But when he steps closer to the bed, King's lips part in a moan too thin to hold sense. His tongue lolls against cracked teeth. The physician sees the way the king's eyes flicker at shadows on the canopy overhead, chasing ghosts who come to claim their debts. He imagines each breath as a coin dropped into the hush, the final wealth of a body that once believed itself. too vast to fall. His fingers tremble worse now, the bottle knocking gently against the rim of the cup. He braces his wrist with his other hand, but the hush makes the small sound echo. A hollow tap that seems to rattle through the carved bedposts and the heavy drapes that billow when the king's lungs hitch for air. He lifts the cup to the royal mouth, tips it just so, watches a dribble slide past the king's chin into the folds of the pillow. There is no protest. There's no roar. The lion's throat, once thick with feasts and boasts, opens only to let slip a breath sour with decay. The physician wipes the spill with the edge of his sleeve, as if the stain might shame him more than the truth it reveals. That nothing in the bottles will hold back the hush. Not this night, not ever. In the corner of the room, the priest shifts. On his knees, voice murmuring low as beads slide through his fingers. He does not look at the physician. He does not have to. They both feel the same chill, the same waiting. Outside, the orchard trees scratch at the walls, bare branches ticking. Against the leaded glass-like fingers tapping to be let in, the physician sets the bottle down too quickly. It clinks against its brother vials, glass chattering like teeth in the draft that slips through the curtains. He flexes his hands, rubs his palms together, tries to rub the tremor out of his skin. He thinks of the scrolls stacked in his study, all the recipes and cures inked by candlelight, the borrowed words of men who once claimed that nature can be forced to yield its secrets if only one crushes the right route, boils the right bark, says the right prayer. But here in this hush, beneath the canopy of a bed that has held too many final breaths, the secrets stay locked tight. The hush feeds on them, folds them into the stone, so they linger in the mortar long after the last vial has dried. A breath catches the king's throat, working once, twice. The physician leans close, lips parted as if to speak, but no word. Comes. His hand hovers over the coverlet, fingers splayed as if he might press the life back through the king's fevered skin. Instead, the hush takes the sound of that final raking sigh and tucks it deep into the corners of the velvet drapes. He lowers his head. His hands fall to his sides. They shake still, not from the cold, but from the knowing that no draught or potion can hold back what the hush has always owned. Somewhere in the hallway, footsteps pause just outside the door, a page waiting for the word that must come. But for now, the hush holds its breath, letting the last flicker of a royal pulse slip from the physician's trembling hands into the stones, where the secrets of kings belong. Down the corridor where the torchlight flickers dull against centuries of soot, the great stair waits wide enough for a king's hunting party to thunder down to abreast, narrow enough now to trap. The hush between each stone tread like breath caught behind a dying man's teeth. The hush holds its place here, curling under the carved balustrade, sliding beneath the boots of the men who hover near the top landing, heads bent, words caught in their throats before they dare break the spell of waiting. Tonight the hush carries the weight of heavy boots. One by one, courtiers pace its curve, spurs catching the flicker of torchlight, keels striking the stone in rhythms too steady for a house that knows its master's heart, stutters in the room above. A steward, his cloak dusted with cinders from the hearth, shifts his weight from step to step. His hand drags along the polished rail, fingertips tracing the grooves worn by years of hands slick with sweat and secrets. Below, near the foot of the stair, a guard leans against the great door that opens to the garden court. His boots, broad and scarred by seasons spent stamping mud from the fields, leave prints on the rushes scattered across the flags. He lifts one foot, then the other, rolling the ache from his soles, the hush of his breath rising in pale puffs, before dissolving into the draught that creeps along the ground. He remembers the stories, how these stairs once trembled under the stomp of the king's fury, how laughter rang down from the gallery when the royal boots crossed the threshold, and lesser men flattened themselves against the walls to let power pass. A flicker of memory stirs at the landing. A young page lingers 2 steps below the steward, chin tucked into the collar of his doublet, eyes fixed on the hush that drips from the top of the stair like candle wax. He has never seen the king awake, only glimpses of a broad hand reaching for the goblet, the shifting mass of velvet curtains pulled close against the smell of ointments. Yet tonight he knows the echo of those boots. He knows how the hush eats each step, dulling the thud until it feels like walking through wool soaked in secrets. A door creaks open above. Leather soles scrape against the stone landing. The quiet hush shivering with the faint sound of fabric dragging over rushes. A physician emerges first, head lowered, face pale as parchment. The hush clinging to the hem of his coat like a final confession. He does not speak. His boots find the edge of the top step, hesitate, then drift down. Each tread creaking in the hush that holds the house tight in its throat. Behind him, the chamberlain appears. His boots are newer, calfskin polished by a servant's hand, until the toe gleams, even in the dying light of the torch. He carries the hush with him like a cloak. Each step measured so the creak of the stair does not betray what has already been decided behind the heavy door. His eyes flick to the steward, to the page, to the guard waiting in the shadow below. No words pass his lips. He holds them tight behind his teeth, like a coin that must not be spent until the right ear leans close. The steward shifts his boots, leather soles squeaking just enough to make the hush snap around him like a curtain drawn too quickly. He wants to speak, to ask if the king has spoken, if the final sigh was caught by the priest's waiting ear, but the hush presses the words back down his throat. He swallows them, letting them sink like stones into his belly, and nods instead. The page sees it, feels the weight of that silent nod echo down into his slippers, small and soft beside the heavy boots that mark the stair with scuffs too deep for any rushes to cover. Below, the guard crosses one boot over the other, planting himself at the base of the stair like a door that will not open without a fight. He watches the chamberlain descend, eyes wide at the glimpse of the sealed scroll, clutched tight against the man's chest. The boots pass him by, each step pressing the hush deeper into the flagstones, burying the last roar of a monarch somewhere. Between the fourth and fifth tread, where a blood stain still hides under layers of sand and candle ash, somewhere far above, the hush still breathes in the king's chamber, velvet curtains, fluttering once more around the hollow of a bed too vast, now for the small gasp of breath that rattled there moments ago. The boots carry that hush down the stair. Each step, an echo of the heartbeat that failed in the dark. No one speaks when they reach the ground. The hush has already told them everything they need to know. The guard shifts his boots again, settles his spear against the wall. The page presses himself. Back into the shadows, slippers silent as the flick of a mouse's tail. The steward turns his gaze toward the crack under the great door, where the wind rattles the frost on the panes and the hush leaks out into the gardens that wait for a dawn, now freed from its king, and the boots. The heavy boots stand still. At last, on the flagstone floor, a hush gathering at their heels like a rumor too old for any man's tongue, yet true enough to outlive every footfall that ever dared cross these stairs. Into the dark, when she lifts the cloth again, she does not look at the courtier. She does not watch the physician swallow down the tremor in his throat. She looks only at the king, at the bed soaked through with the weight of power slipping from his limbs, leaving behind nothing but a hush that settles under the canopy like a final crown cold, silent and far too heavy to lift. In the king's chamber, across from the bed where his breath drifts thin as morning mist, stands a tall window with leaded panes that rattle when the orchard wind stirs. Its latch has been warped by years of frost that wedge into the wood grain, swelling it just enough each winter that no servant's hand can press it shut. They have stuffed the cracks with scraps of cloth and old linen. But still the hush slips in a cold thread of air that curls around the bedposts and makes the velvet drapes billow like a shroud drawing breath. Tonight, that window breathes. For him, the king lies heavy and unmoving, eyes rolled back to some dream that only the hush can hear. But the window shivers with every gust, as if the orchard just beyond its glass leans closer to see what remains of the man who once thundered across its. Knees hugged to his chest, chin resting on his threadbare sleeve. He was sent here to watch the candles, to snuff them before dawn spills its blue light across the floor. But he watches the window instead. The way the draft lifts the curtain hem and lets the hush whisper against the king's ankles. He wonders if the orchard remembers the roar of hunting horns, the snap of banners in spring wind, the cheers of courtiers who scattered when the king's laughter turned sharp as a blade. The physician glances once at the window, brow furrowed under the weight of helpless anger. He gestures for the boy to stuff the cloth deeper into the sill's crack. But the boy only shrugs, small shoulders swallowed by a tunic 2 winters too small. The window has its own will now. The hush will not be turned away by rags and trembling fingers. It rides the wind from tree to stone to bedpost, curling around the king's throat as if it knows how to hush that final rattle for good. Outside, the orchard branches scratch the wall like old claws. The moon rides high but thin, a sliver of cold silver that gleams off the frost-wilted hedges in the low garden gate. The king once kicked open with a boot heel when rage outstripped sense. The hush remembers that too, the echo of boots in the orchard dirt. The bark of laughter that turned to silence when a single breath failed to return. A maid crosses the room, skirts brushing the rushes. She lifts a taper from its iron stand, shields the flame from the draft with her palm. Her eyes catch on the boy by the window, a pale scrap of a thing whose gaze is pinned not on the king but on the orchard beyond. She knows what he sees, nothing but the hush moving between the trees, shadows thick enough to pretend they are more than frost and bare branches, shadows thick enough to carry the last sigh of a king out past the garden wall where no crown can. Bind it, the king moans, a ragged sound that slips under the drapes. The window trembles at the noise, the panes rattling so softly the maid thinks they are crying. She wants to close it, wants to drive nails through the frame if she must. Her hands stay at her side. The hush is settled in her too, coiled like smoke behind her teeth. Some things do not want shutting out. Some fears must have their way in. By the hearth, the physician kneels, rummaging among the small glass vials lined up like soldiers who know they will not march again. His hand hovers over a bottle of syrup gone thick with age. He knows better than to hope now. The hush keeps one eye on him, even as it strokes the king's clammy cheek. The draft lifts the edge of the fur coverlet, lets the cold slip down to where the royal ring presses. Against a swollen knuckle that no longer bends in prayer or threat, the boy shifts on the window seat, breath fogging the glass. He lifts a finger, tracing a circle in the frost, round and round, as if he might spin the hush into shape. When he stops, the circle stays there, a pale eye staring back at the orchard, where nothing moves but the wind that carries the king's fear like a secret told through cracked teeth. A final gust pushes through the latch, ending the candle flames. Lo, the shadows stretch long across the floorboards, creeping toward the bed, slipping into the hush that thickens at the king's throat. The window sighs on its hinges. The orchard waits, a tangle of black branches and old roots, ready to cradle what remains when the hush finally slips free, and when it does, when the last breath stutters from a chest too tired to hold it. The window that would not close will fling itself wider still, letting the hush drift through its broken latch, carrying the lion's final exhale out to the orchard, where the frost will keep it safe among the tangled limbs until spring wakes the roots again, beneath. The stone floors where courtiers shift, on velvet benches, and the hush coils thick around a royal bed. A narrow passage snakes through the foundations of the house, secret artery carved long ago for whispers and flight when power turned its teeth on the ones who once wore its smile. Few dare speak of it now, though the servants know its hollow chill. The way the damp air clings to your throat and carries every footstep straight into the hush that waits in the dark. Tonight, the rats keep company there, small bodies slipping. Between gaps in ancient stones, their claws scratching a soft rhythm against the damp mortar. They move single file, whiskers trembling at the scent of salt and old candle wax, weaving around the scatter of straw that litters the floor where servants once paused with buckets of rushes and basins of secrets too heavy to carry up the winding stair. A stable boy crouches near the passage mouth, breath pluming in the cold draft that slips from the cracks. His candle guttered out long ago, leaving only the glow of a lantern half buried behind a broken crate. He came here on a dare, A childish wager tossed between scullery boys when the hush of a dying king stretched too tight to bear above the floorboards. Now he sits with his knees drawn to his chest, eyes wide as coins, watching the rat's nose at the scraps of linen. He dropped when he stumbled on the loose stone that gave way to the secret door. He thinks of the stories the laundry maids tell when the hearth is banked low, how queens once hid here in the hush before dawn. Velvet slippers soaked through with fear as they fled from boots heavy with the king's wrath. How traitors slipped down this passage with scrolls tucked into the lining of their doublets, each footstep echoing like a promise they would never live to keep. The hush remembers. He feels it now, brushing his hair like a mother's cold hand, slipping under his collar where sweat chills against his skin. A rat pauses near his boot, eyes catching the lantern's faint glow. Its ribs show through its fur, thin as reed bundles tied for kindling. The boy wonders if it too hears the hush above, the priest's soft Latin, the physician's chair scraping the rushes when he stands to lean closer to the bed, where the king's breath wheezes like a dying hearth. He tries to imagine a crown as heavy as a stone slab, pinning a man to his bed until only the hush can lift it free. One of the rats squeaks, startled by a shifting draft that slides along the passage like a sigh. The boy pulls his knees tighter. He wishes he had not come alone. He wishes he could press the loose stone back into its place, seal the secret back where it belongs, but the hush has already slipped through the gap, brushing his ear with the faint echo of footsteps that might be real or might be only memory replaying itself in the dark, in the walls overhead. Boots tread soft but urgent courtiers moving through the gallery with heads bent low, voices locked behind teeth as they pass the word from mouth to mouth. Not long now, not long at all. The hush trickles down the passage like water, curling around the boy's ankles, settling into the straw. The rats freeze for a breath. They're tiny, hearts fluttering in the hush that tastes of fever and secrets sweet as rot. He shifts, knocking the lantern. Its flame sputters and flares, throwing shapes against the stone. Shadows like robed men bent over parchment, like queens pressing rings into cold hands, like the king himself. Broad shoulders huddled low as he clutched a scroll meant to die. In this passage, but somehow found its way back to the hearth upstairs, a rat scurries over his shoe. He stifles a gasp, breath caught in his throat. He knows he will tell no one about this, not the guard who stands dozing by the gallery door. Not the other boys who wait near the stables with eyes wide for news they don't want to hear. Some hushes must be carried alone, tucked into the hollow of the chest like a secret passage under the ribs. When the lantern flickers out, the boy stands. He presses one hand to the cold stone, feels it shiver under his palm, as if the hush itself breathes through the mortar. The rats vanish into a crack behind the crates, claws ticking a lullaby down tunnels too narrow for any king to crawl through now. Above him, the house shifts in its sleep. Draft sighs down the stair, brushes his cheek, lifts the straw and gentle. Swirls that dance like ghosts too small to haunt a chamber so vast. He slips from the passage, feet bare on the flags, leaving the hush behind him in the dark where the rats keep their watch, tiny guardians of secrets that never die, only scurry deeper when the crown falls silent at last. In the hour when the hush tastes like the edge of dawn, soft, damp, and breathless, a single candle burns low on the small table beside the king's bed. Its wax has spilled in rivers down the brass holder, pooling on the table's warped surface like pale blood, gone cold. The flame leans and flickers each time the king's breath rasps through the canopy curtains. Gust from the window that will not close, stirring it just enough to make the shadows shift across the furrow. Of his brow, a maid kneels on the rushes at the foot of the bed, eyes half closed, lips cracked from the dry air that curls in around the seams of the velvet drapes. She holds a folded cloth soaked in lavender water that long ago lost its sweetness, its perfume beaten down by the sour bite of rot that clings to the king's skin like an old promise. She watches the flame, the way it dances each time the king's chest shudders, as though the candle itself breathes with him, a small heartbeat of light in a room too heavy with the hushed dot on the far side. The physician sits slumped on a low stool, elbows braced on his knees, head dipped so that his wig slips, slightly revealing the thin scalp beneath. His hands hang between his knees, twitching now and then, as if they still expect to be called to work to hold a vial to the king's lips.
Ow.
To press fingers to a pulse that no longer cares to steady itself. But the hush has stolen that duty. From him, all that remains is the candle, its flame licking at the dark while the king drifts further from the warmth it promises. A creak of hinges breaks the hush. The door opens wide enough for the steward to slip inside, boots leaving tiny arcs in the rushes. He does not speak. He lifts his eyes to the king, then drops them to the maid, kneeling by the post, her hand trembling with the cloth she presses. To the king's wrist. The steward's gaze catches on the candle, the lean of its flame, the curve of the wax bending under its own heat. He thinks of all the candles burned for this man in every chapel in London, flames guttered out in prayer, for mercy that was never meant to be granted. The hush seems to swell with every second the king keeps breathing. A rattle, a pause, a sigh that leaks out under the drapes like a secret begging for release. The flame flinches. The wax drips faster. A draft curls from the window, cold and certain, lifting the hem of a tapestry that hangs behind the bed. Velvet breathes once, twice, then settles back. A page boy stands by the hearth, shoulders hunched, arms crossed over a chest, too small for the hush that squeezes it tight tonight. His eyes stay fixed on the candle as if the wick might speak. The truth, none of their lips dare shape. He remembers the older boys warning him how a king's last breath must be watched like a fox watches a henhouse. For in that final exhale, the hush carries power out the door, slips it down the stair, scatters it like seed on the frost-hard garden path, and then, in the hush that swallows even the king's final moan, the candle wavers. The flame licks sideways, catches the curled lip of hardened wax, and leans too far from its wick. The maid sees it first, a tremor, a shiver, then a spill. The whole length of candle tumbles from the brass cup, wax snapping as it strikes the table's edge. For a breath, the flame burns bright against the rushes scattered below. Then the hush gathers it in, and it dies with a hiss so soft the king's last breath almost covers it. No one moves at first. The physician lifts his head. The steward's boots shuffle closer to the bed. The page's eyes flick from the darkened wick to the king's face, waiting for the chest to rise again, waiting for the hush to spit him back into the world that once bent its knee at the sound of his roar. But the hush holds steady now. The window rattles once, a final draft sweeping across the rushes, stirring the cooled wax that pools like a crown dropped in the dirt. A priest's voice drifts up the stair beyond the chamber door. A thin thread of Latin that slips under the hush like a stitch closing the mouth of an old wound. The maid lowers the cloth, folding it over her wrist like a shroud. She glances at the candle, the spill of wax, the dead wick, then at the king, whose eyes stare at nothing under lids that cannot quite close. Somewhere in the orchard, the frost shifts on the bare branches. A crow calls once, cracking the hush just enough to remind the house that the hush has work to do now. It must gather the final warmth, the final word. It's a final promise that this crown once held aloft in hands that tremble no more. When they lift the fallen candle and set it aside, its wick black and curled in the pooling wax, no one tries to light it again. The hush has taken its flame the way it will take the king, folding him into the stones, tucking him beneath rushes and marble and the orchard's deep roots, where even the candle's last breath will settle in the dark and sleep until the frost breaks open for another dawn, when the hush inside the king's chamber at last releases its grip, when the final breath lies still on the velvet pillow, and the rushes under the bed remember what they have cradled. The bells begin. One by one, as dawn crawls slow and gray over the orchard wall, the chapel bells lift their iron tongues to the hush and break it apart. Like frost splintering under a heavy boot, their toll drifts through the frozen gardens, past the rows of you. Hedges brittle with rime, through the orchard where branches stand clawed and bare under the pale bite of morning light. Each strike of the bell rolls over the cracked pathways and stone steps slick with ice. echoing off the cold glass of windows that still rattle from the wind that slipped through the window that would not close. A gardener stands near the knot of rose bushes, pruning shears forgotten in his gloved hand. He looks toward the tower where the bells swing their round song into the hush, each peal catching in the stiff bramble that will bloom again. Come spring, when this death has already settled into rumor, he remembers trimming these same roses. The day the king returned from his first hunt as a crowned man, velvet cloaked damp with sweat, and the scent of deer's blood clinging to his boots. How small that roar seems now, drowned out by iron mouths that speak the truth no man's whisper dares utter yet. Near the frozen fountain, a maid stands with her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, water jug balanced against her hip. Does not move to fill it from the thin trickle that still weeps through the stone spout. Her eyes drift up toward the tower's pale silhouette. The hush wraps around her ankles like thawing mist, carrying the tolling deeper into the soles of her feet until she feels each note sink through her bones. The orchard fox slinks across the garden's edge, tail low, ears flicking back each time. The bells ring out. It pauses near the frost-blackened herbs, nose twitching at the cold air that still carries a breath of sickness, an old candle smoke drifting from the king's window. The hush does not frighten it, only the sudden crack of the bells. Each strike scattering crows from the tangled hedges in a clatter of wings that looks almost like a prayer torn from black cloth. Inside the house, where the hush now drips, from stair to corridor, the courtiers gather near the door that once hid the king's final gasp. Some bow their heads. Some shift their feet on the flagstones, ears straining for the next toll, as if counting each peal might grant them time to stitch new loyalties before the hush settles. Too deep in the walls, Page clutches a folded parchment to his chest, its seal pressed so hard against his palm that he feels it pulse with every swing of the bell. He thinks of the window, the fallen candle, the hush that rose like a tide over the bed and left the room stripped bare of any word but gone. Farther out, where the orchard wall meets the old plague gate, the bells reach the stone wards that know death too well to weep for kings. The hush slips through the cracks there, finding the hospital beds where straw lies fresh but untouched. Lavender buds scattered by a boy who once knelt in the chapel for mercy that did not come. The bells do not care whom they wake, their toll is for all. Kings, stable boys. Maids who carry water in cracked jugs, priests who press stale words of absolution into lips too dry to swallow them. Back in the garden, frost beads along the iron fence that rings the rose beds. The gardener kneels, shears forgotten in the brittle grass. He listens as the hush shatters under the bell's hammering call, each echo ringing in the empty corners of the orchard where no fruit clings now, only the promise that new branches will come when the hush folds this last roar under root and soil. The maid lifts her jug at last, turns toward the path that winds past the chapel door. She does not flinch at the bells now. Their toll is her heartbeat, her footstep, the breath that clouds before her lips in the frozen dawn. She wonders if the hush will cling to the hedges after this, if the orchard trees will carry the echo in their bark, if the roses will bloom sweeter for the warmth they draw from all the secrets buried here. The bells toll on, over gardens glazed with ice, over frost that clings to the bramble where the king's voice once drifted like a hunting call through early blooms, over walls that cradle the hush in their stones until the next voice rises to claim what no crown can keep forever. When the last note fades, the hush sighs back into the soil, into the hedgerows, into the roots of every tree that remembers the echo of footsteps too heavy to last. The hush waits for spring, for the frost to break, for the roses to open their red mouths. Again, soft petals drinking the warmth of a dawn that no bell, no crown, no king's final breath can silence for long. Inside the king's chamber, where the hush lies heavy as wet wool, and the morning light creeps through the window that never closed. A final oath curls on the stale air like breath that will not die. The king lies slack now, jaw gone soft, eyes turned to some shadow far above the velvet canopy. But near his bed, the hush still tastes of words not quite finished, syllables, clinging to the folds of linen soaked through with sweat and fear. the chamberlain stands, close enough to feel the chill radiating off the king's unmoving hand. His gloves creak when he flexes his fingers, as if they too can feel the old promise pressing at his ribs. He bends low, ear hovering above cracked lips that no longer shape commands or curses. He tells himself there is meaning in that final rasp, the way it fluttered through teeth yellowed and split by two. Many years of feasting and gnawing at power's bone. A priest hovers at the foot of the bed, robes caught in the draft from the warped window. He clutches his psalter so tight the leather creaks, pages damp where his thumb has pressed prayers into the margins. His eyes drift from the king's slack face to the hush that gathers at the canopy's edge, that thick pocket of air where words slip like ink bleeding across damp paper. He knows what he heard, a promise, a plea, or a curse that now folds itself into the stone walls. In the corner, the maid kneels on the rushes, the cloth in her hands gone limp, water dripping through her fingers and soaking her apron. She dares not look up, but she feels it too, the hush swollen with that final oath. She imagines it lodged beneath the mattress, tangled in the feather ticking, curling up into the wooden posts that will outlive them all. She wants to press her palm flat against the king's chest, to catch that last echo before the hush tucks it away for good. Outside the door, boots scuff the flagstones. A page stands ready with a quill and a slip of parchment, the ink freezing on the nib each time he lifts it from the pot. He has heard the talk, how a king's last words must be sealed before the hush devours them. How an oath unclaimed can bloom into rumor that poisons every corridor from hearth to hedge. He strains his ears, listening for a voice that is already lost, but all he hears is the creak of the chamberlain's cloak, the soft hush of the priest's Latin, the sigh of linen falling loose from a hand that once signed death warrants with the flick of a ringed finger. A candle gutters on the bedside. Table. Its flame bends low, then lifts again, throwing the king's shadow against the bed curtains, a thin outline blurred where the velvet swallows it whole. For a heartbeat, the hush feels thick enough to speak. It hums at the priest's ear, brushes the maid's cheek, curls around the quill poised just beyond the chamber door. At! But then the window rattles, letting the orchard wind in, and the hush gulps the words down deep. The chamberlain straightens, gloves smoothing the king's. Blanket though the king will never feel its warmth again. He turns to the priest, eyes sharp as a blade not yet drawn. The priest nods, voice cracking through the hush with syllables that are part prayer, part plea. It is done, he whispers, though he knows the hush holds the truth. Done, yet not finished. Spoken, yet not sealed, the maid dips her cloth in. The basin again, though the sweat on the king's brow has dried to salt. She presses it to his temple anyway, as if she might coax the last promise out. A name, a command. A scrap of mercy for the servants who will carry this hush in there. Hair and sleeves for the rest of their lives? But the king's lips do not stir. The hush has settled in his throat like earth packed tight in a grave. Outside, the page bows his head, the quill tip tapping the parchment. He writes what he did not hear, words that sound grand enough to survive. The hush when it slips down the stair and out into the frozen gardens. He writes for the ears that will listen in the halls below, boots shifting on stone as they wait for the final rumor to grow teeth and take shape. A crow lands on the sill of the warped window, claws scratching the leaded pane. Its black eye gleams. In the soft dawn light, watching the hush as it curls through the bed curtains and sinks into the king's chest, where no heart beats anymore. The crow calls, once, a sound sharp enough to snap the hush like brittle twine. But the promise does not break, it burrows deeper, wrapping itself around every stone that holds up this house. When the priest's voice falls silent, the hush remains thick with a final oath no tongue will ever shape again. A promise, a curse, a lie, it does not matter now. The hush owns it. It seeps into the walls, into the stair, into the frost that bites the orchard roots. And long after the candles gutter out, after the velvet drapes are pulled aside, and the king's body lifted to its marble cradle, the hush will keep that last breath safe, hidden, waiting for the day when the stone splits and the hush must speak it back to the world. In the hush that seeps through the cracks of dawn, the king's shadow lingers longer than his breath. It curls beneath the tapestried door, slides along the flagstones of the gallery, drifts into corners where polished boots now pace with soft, urgent steps. Outside his chamber, the courtiers' weight collars pulled tight, gloved hands pressed to lips that dare not speak too loudly for fear they might wake what now belongs to the hush alone. They stand in a knot near the wide window that overlooks the orchard, their reflections layered against the frost-glazed glass like painted ghosts. Each man feels the pull of that room behind the heavy oak door. The weight of the crown no longer anchored to warm flesh, but to the hush that clings to velvet pillows and the damp sheets. Still carrying the king's final fear, a young noble clears his throat, the sound cracking through the hush like a boot stepping on ice. He glances at the steward beside him, eyes darting toward the shadow that leaks under the threshold. He wants to run to find a hearth where no one speaks. The dead man's name, to wash the scent of rosewater and fever from his cuffs. But he cannot yet. Not while the hush still holds their feet rooted here like weeds waiting for the frost to lift. Farther down the corridor, a pair of ladies stand shoulder to shoulder, veils drawn low, though there is no true mourning yet, only the promise of it stitched into the hush. One whispers to the other, words so thin they dissolve in the cold air before they reach the steward's ear. They speak of the seal, the scrolls tucked beneath cushions, the name that will be spoken next when the hush breaks wide enough to let ambition slip through. They do not say the king's name, the hush will not allow it. It catches the syllables in their throats, folds them into the shadows that trail behind their silken slippers as they inch toward the stair. A courtier pulls open a small shutter, letting dawn's blade of blue light cut across the hall. He looks toward the gardens where frost clings to every hedge and the bells have already fallen silent. He imagines the hush drifting there too, settling among the bare branches that remember the thunder of the king's laughter when summer was thick with roses and the orchard walls hummed with bees instead of secrets. Now the hush grows heavy on his shoulders. Pressing him closer to the door, he longs to slip beyond. Boots scuff the rushes. A page arrives, chest-heaving, parchment. Clutched to his chest, ink still wet at the edges. He pauses when he sees their faces, the hollow eyes, the lips bitten raw in the hush of waiting. The steward steps forward, fingers brushing the boy's sleeve, reading the seal before the hush can snatch it away. He nods once, slow and heavy, as though the air has turned to water around him. The page lowers his eyes, hands trembling as he presses the parchment forward. Words written to be spoken before the hush devours them for good. The young noble lets out a breath that curls in the cold. He turns his back on the chamber door. Each step he takes is careful, boots sliding on. The rush is soft enough that the hush does not snap or crack. The women follow, skirts brushing the stone, whispers fluttering behind veils like moths, searching for a lamp too far to find. One by one, the courtiers slip down the gallery, past portraits, whose painted eyes watch from shadows streaked by the pale dawn. At the stairs' curve, a guard lifts his spear in stiff salute. He feels the hush too, the way it clings to the hem of each man's cloak, the way it breathes along the flagstones, even after the courtiers pass. He knows they flee not the corpse in the bed, but the shadow it casts, thick as tar, seeping through the house with every rumor that finds its voice in the hushed outside. In the orchard, frost drips from branch tips like beads of sweat shaken loose from a fevered brow. The hush trails behind the courtiers as they step into the dawn, boots crunching over gravel paths still rimmed with yesterday's footprints. Some will carry the king's secrets folded into letters pressed deep in leather satchels. Some will forget his face by dusk, swallowing his shadow in the warmth of a fire far from the orchard's reach. But the hush will not forget. It clings to the stair rail, the window latch, the tapestry that shifts in the draft as they pass. It hums under their soles, curling up through cracks in the stone to remind each footstep that a king's shadow is not easily outrun. Long after, the courtiers flee into the gardens, their words hushed behind glove and veil. That shadow lingers, stitched into the hush of a house that will cradle it until the orchard blooms again and new boots walk these halls. Unknowing of the breath, they stir awake each time they speak of crowns and silence. In the hush that creeps through the king's chamber long after the final prayers have fallen flat against the velvet drapes, the royal body lies unmoving beneath the heavy canopy, tucked in as if sleep might come again. But there is no sleep. Here, only the sour scent of skin that surrenders its warmth to the hush, drop by drop, hour by hour. Until the air tastes of iron and old sweat and fear, no linen can soak away. Outside the bed curtains, the servants linger on soft feet, cloths, clutched two chapped hands, eyes fixed on the shifting folds that hide what they do not dare name aloud. The steward stands closest, shoulders bent under the weight of the hush that now owns every breath in this room. He knows what the body will become if left too long. He knows how the hush will fold it in, turning flesh to rot that seeps into the mattress, the floorboards, the rushes, yet no one moves to carry him out. The order has not come. Parchment with the new seal has not passed from gloved hand to gloved hand. The king remains where he fell silent. A ruin of swollen limbs and damp curls stuck to a brow that once wore a crown with the arrogance of a god. Now the hush drips from the canopy like rain down a church roof. Gathering in the folds of the blankets where bruises bloom in secret, a maid creeps forward. Pressing her palm to the fur coverlet just above his ribs, she means to smooth it, to make it neat for the eyes that will come later, the court scribes. The priests, the nobles who must see the husk before they bow to what comes next. But the hush clings to her wrist, sticky as honey left too long. By the hearth, she feels the heat that has not yet left him, the sharp tang of something souring beneath the layers of velvet and fur, in the shadows near the hearth. The physician wraps his cloak tight around his thin frame. He watches the damp spots spreading on the sheets. He knows what waits if they do not lift him soon. The body will swell and split, the hush turned rank and heavy, thick enough to drown every prayer spoken under this roof. He thinks of the scrolls, that worn of rot, the treatises inked by monks who saw kings crack open in summer heat. Flies buzzing at silk cuffs and golden rings that slip from bloated fingers. He shudders, breath caught in the hush that now tastes like vinegar, left too long in an unstoppered vial. Beyond the door, courtiers drift like ghosts along the gallery, heads bent together in murmured counsel. Some say he should be moved at once, wrapped in linen, sealed in lead, locked in a vault before the hush claims more than flesh and bone. Others say, let him lie, let him soak the sheets and the mattress, let the hush do its slow work while they decide which hands will carry the crown he left behind. The hush slips through their words like smoke, staining every vow they make behind. Gloved hands, the window rattles. Frost drips from the cracked panes where the orchard wind pushes through. Cold fingers brushing the king's feet where the coverlet slips loose. Beneath the fur, the skin shifts. A trick of the draft, the hush wants them to believe. But the steward sees the stain blooming wider, where the sores break open, leaking secrets into the linen that no priest can absolve now. A fly, bold enough to risk the hush, lands on the king's collarbone. Its wings tremble in the candlelight. Legs tasting the salt of royal skin gone soft and gray. The maid swats at it, but another comes, and another. Drawn by the hush's promise that all things return to the same dark soil in the end. She wipes her palm on her apron, eyes on the canopy that sags low above the king's head, heavy with the scent of roses crushed beneath rot. When night comes again, the hush will thicken. It will settle into the folds of the drapes, slip between. The floorboards nestle into the hair that still clings to the king's temples. It will turn sweet then sour, until the rushes under the bed drink every drop they can hold. Only then will they lift him, wrap him tight, seal the hush inside lead and silken stone. Until that moment, the hush owns this room. It keeps the servants from opening the window wider. It keeps the steward's feet rooted at the foot of the bed, keeps the king right where he is, a ruin beneath velvet. Rotting in the hush he once commanded with a roar now, too soft for any ear to catch. Outside, the orchard branches claw at the shutters. A fox slips through the frost-hardened grass, nose lifted to the air that carries the first whiff of the hush turning rank. The house holds its breath, and the king's body, heavy and still, lies waiting, left to rot where the hush can keep its promise that all things, no matter how loud they once roared, return to the same soft dark in the end. In the hush that settles after the king's last breath has soured the velvet curtains and soaked the linen sheets. A boy slips through the side door beneath the scullery arch, a folded scrap of parchment, pressed tight to his ribs. Frost bites at his cheeks, the orchard grass stiff with silver needles that snap beneath his bare soles. But the hush follows him, curling around his ankles, lifting the hem of his coat as he slips. Between rows of trees that remember the thunder of royal hunts and summer feasts that bloomed fat and full beneath their boughs, the orchard is still. Now, branches clawing at a sky the color of old pewter, a dawn that comes slow and mean to a house that has outlived its king. Frost feathers the gnarled bark, rimming the mossy roots where the hush pools like water left standing too long. The boy breathes it in with every step, the hush slipping under his tongue until it tastes of secrets he was never meant to carry in his fist. The parchment sweats against his skin, ink smudged where the seal cracked, where the wax gave way in. The sick room's heat is not read it, cannot read it, but he feels its weight, the promise coiled inside each cramped line. Names scribbled in a hand grown too unsteady to shape the truth neatly. Debts tallied beside threats, the hush of a dying man pressed flat, between folds that no courtier saw slip from the physician's sleeve when the candle fell, and the hush swallowed the final oath. A fox drifts ahead of him through the trees, fur brushed with frost, tail low to the earth. It pauses near the old bench where the king once sat with a goblet brimming, eyes on the orchard's summer blossom. Now the branches hang bare, clutching the hush like children hoarding crumbs. The boy stops too, chest heaving, the hush blooming, warm in the gap between each heartbeat. He wants to drop the parchment, tuck it under the roots, let the hush bury it in the cold soil, but his feet press on barefoot through the frost, leaving small prints the orchard will drink when the sun climbs high enough to wake the ground. Beyond the last row of trees, the garden wall rises, stones slick with lichen, the hush pressed into its cracks like secrets salted into old wounds. He knows where the loose brick lies, where generations of kitchen maids and grooms tucked away scraps of meat. Stolen coins, a ring slipped from a royal finger when the hush thickened with betrayal. He scrabbles at the mortar with numb fingers, frost-burned knuckles scraping against stone that remembers the soft drip of rot and the slip of cold silver. Inside the gap slides the parchment deep, tucking it behind a wad of straw gone brittle. In the freeze, his breath plumes white in the hush that gathers close, as if the orchard itself wants to taste what he hides there. He presses the brick back until it grinds against the mortar, a hush in stone form, sealing the words that might shift the world by dusk if tongues loosen where they should not. A crow cries in the high branches, its voice sharp enough to split the hush for a heartbeat. The boy flinches, palms still on the stone, ears straining for boots on gravel, for the hush to break open with the slap of hands dragging him back to the scullery door. But the orchard only creaks a low groan of branches turned brittle by frost, and the memory of Hunt's no hoofbeats will rouse again. He steps back, barefoot on the iron grass, eyes drifting over the orchard that will bloom come spring, heavy, with the hush of this hidden thing pressed deep into its roots. One day, when the frost breaks, the parchment may crumble into pulp, ink bleeding into the soil until each blossom tastes faintly of the king's final threat. Or someone may find it a hand braver than his, a mouth hungry enough to speak. What the hush tried to keep. He turns toward the low gate, where the hedge parts like a cracked tooth, out dawn, pooling pale along the garden's edge. His feet leave small dark prints behind, each one filling with the hush as the orchard folds the secret into its oldest roots. Above him, the crow calls again, wings rattling frost from the limbs, and the hush settles once more deep under bark and moss and stone, holding the king's last sharp words in its cold palm, waiting for the orchard's thaw to loosen what should never have been buried alive in the quietest wing of the house. Far from the orchard's frost-bitten hush and the bed where the king's body sinks deeper into the linens, there is a chamber where the crown rests. There's no roaring voice here, no rattle of breath clinging to velvet curtains. Only the soft creak of floorboards under the steward's boots and the hush that drapes the room like heavy damask. The crown sits on a velvet cushion, its gold dulled by candle smoke, its gemstones swallowing the flickering light with a cold, patient gleam. It has been cleaned once already, polished by a boy who stood trembling over the cushion, cloth in hand, eyes wide at the hush pressing against his spine as if the stones themselves might speak if he polished too hard. Now it waits on the long oak table, near a goblet half filled with spiced wine that has gone cold. The steward stands behind the table, fingers tapping the carved edge where generations of signatures were inked into parchment that decided who would kneel, who would rise, who would vanish into the hush without so much as a word. He glances at the crown but does not touch it. His hands hover just above the velvet, breath ghosting the tips of the ermine fur that rims the base like a wreath of soft winter dot outside the chamber door. 2 guards shift their weight, spears balanced across their chests. One of them clears his throat when the hush thickens, as if it might slip under his breastplate and coil around his heart. They know the crown must not be left alone. They know what whispers follow gold when it lies unclaimed even for an hour. They know the hush will find a way to slip that weight onto another head before the frost breaks on the orchard wall. A clerk kneels by the hearth, scribbling a fresh page of names. Those who must swear, those who must bear witness, those who will pretend the hush does not know the truth buried behind the orchard stones. His quill scratches too loudly in the silence, each letter drawn with a hand that trembles when he pauses to warm his fingers over the guttering coals. He dares not look at the crown. He writes as if the hush might read over his shoulder, waiting for him to misspell a name that could shift the balance by dawn near the far window. A small girl stands on a footstool, polishing the tall silver mirror that has not known a king's full reflection for weeks. She wipes away the frost that creeps across the glass each night, tracing the hush that blooms there like breath on cold iron. In the mirror's depth, the crown appears twice, once on its cushion, once in the glass, a ghostly twin that seems to lean forward, hungry for a brow to rest upon. The girl wipes faster when her eyes meet that hollow crown, her rag catching on the gilded edge of the frame. The steward steps closer now, breath misting above the cold table. He imagines the heads it is pressed down upon, hair matted with sweat and rose oil, curls turned limp by the hush that gathers in the curls behind the ears when the weight becomes too much. He knows what it costs. He can taste the copper temps of fear. The crown sweats into the pillows when the curtains are drawn shut and the orchard wind claws at the window latches. A priest slips through the door, robes brushing the rushes, the hush folding around him like a cloak. He makes the sign of the cross above the crown, lips moving in Latin, syllables stitched so tightly they sound like thread pulling through wet cloth. The steward bows his head, eyes fixed on the gold rim, the way the rubies gleam like fresh bruises caught in the candle's flame. Beyond the window, the orchard waits in a blue hush. Frost clings to every branch, the secret parchment pressed into the wall's belly, roots curling around it while the crown waits here, hungry and cold. Somewhere out there, the fox paces near the hedgerow, nose lifted to the hush that rides, the breeze back toward the house. When the prayers fade, the steward lifts the crown just enough to feel its weight settle into his palms. It is heavier than he remembers, or perhaps it is the hush that makes it so. He sets it back down, careful not to tip it sideways, careful not to wake the echoes that drift in the tiny hollows behind each gemstone. He does not yet know which brow will bow low enough to wear it next. He does not know whose dreams will rot beneath its gold. He only knows the hush will keep the secret until the door swings wide, till boots echo across the rushes, till voices fill this room with vows that taste of fear and frost, and when they lift it at last, when hands press it to a head that trembles to hold so much hush inside, the orchard will listen. The roots will listen. The stones will remember that for a single breath, the crown waited alone, cold as frost on the orchard wall. Heavy with every promise, the hush will bury when the next roar comes, in the small hours before the sun climbs. High enough to break the orchard's icy hush, a long table is laid out beneath the old beams of the great hall, a table wide enough to bear the weight of a king's body, stiff and swollen, ready to be wrapped in its final shroud. The air here tastes of cold smoke and the bite of new frost drifting in from the garden doors left cracked for the priest's quiet procession. On the table, funeral cloth waits, velvet dark as the orchard's deepest roots, edged in gold. Embroidery dulled by candle soot, and the hush of countless burials come and gone. The cloth hangs over the sides in soft folds that brush the rushes underfoot. And each time a draft slips through the hall, it lifts the fringe just enough to whisper over the stone flags like a promise too cold to keep. A laundress stands at one end, smoothing the heavy fabric with the flat of her palm. Her fingers ache from the chill that creeps through the cloth, a cold that no fire can touch once the hush takes hold. She can still feel the steam that rose when she first pressed the cloth hours ago, boiling the lice and sweat from its velvet nap. But now the hush is settled in the pile, curling around the gold thread like mist around a gravestone at the far end. A priest folds a strip of linen that will bind the king's jaw shut, lips clamped tight to keep the hush inside. He moves, slowly, careful not to snag the weave on the dry burrs of his cracked knuckles. The hush hums under his breath, each Latin word slipping through his teeth like a bead rolled across an altar rail. He dares not look at the bier waiting by the hearth, where the king's body lies swaddled and soiled. Sheets that smell of rosewater turn sour with the scent of death too long left to stew. 2 guards stand watch by the door, spears crossed against the hush that leaks through the threshold. They keep their eyes low, boots planted in the frost pooling at their feet. One taps the butt of his spear now and then, nervous knock against the stone that echoes up into the beams where the hush gathers, sifting through the rafters like flour through a widow's sieve in the shadows by the window. A boy stirs a pail of warm vinegar and rosemary sprigs, dipping a rag again and again, squeezing it out until his fingers wrinkle in the chill. He has heard the others say the hush clings to cloth, that once the king's body is laid here, the velvet will drink up every last sigh, every whisper of treachery and prayer that never found its way past cracked lips. He wipes the tables edge, careful not to touch the dark folds he knows he is not meant to handle. Outside, the orchard branches tremble as frost flakes loosen in the breeze. A crow calls once from the garden wall, its cry bouncing off the stone like a nail tapped into a coffin lid. The laundress shivers, pulls her shawl tighter and runs her hand down the length of the cloth one final time. Beneath her touch, the hush feels alive, not warm, but pulsing with the weight of every king who has lain here before. Every rotting breath sealed away behind velvet and gold, so that the next crown may pretend the hush does not follow every coronation like a shadow. Servant pushes open the doors wider. The sound of boots in the corridor grows louder, the scrape and drag of a bier lifted by shoulders that bow low under the hush. For men bear the weight, 2 at the head, 2 at the feet, their faces turned away from the stained linen wrapped. Around the corpse they can feel shifting under its own slow bloat. Each footstep drags the hush forward, trailing it through the long gallery where portraits watch from dark frames. Eyes glinting with the hush, they too remember when they reach the table. The laundress steps back, hands pressed to her apron. The priest murmurs his final words, voice so thin it weaves into the hush without a ripple. Bearers bend, knees creaking under the weight. The bier thumps softly against the table, the rushes rustling like straw under a stallion's hoof. Cloth drinks up the cold at once. It sighs when the body settles into its velvet cradle, the hush pressing down, heavier now that the crown waits in its chamber. A promise unspoken, but thick on every tongue that dares not break the hush wide open yet. A wind slips through the crack of the garden door, brushing the edge of the cloth so that frost beads on the gold thread. It clings there, glistening like tears that will never fall from the eyes of the men gathered round. One of the guards shifts his spear, boots scraping the flagstone. The laundress feels the hush reach for her fingers where they rest on the edge. Of the velvet, she pulls away, stepping back into the shadows where the hush cannot stain her skin. Outside, the orchard roots remember. Frost seeps deeper into the soil, binding the hush beneath bark and stone. The cloth settles heavier across the king's belly, pressing secrets into the velvet that no warmth will ever shake loose. And when the last candle gutters low beside the bier, the hush folds itself tight around the king's limbs, the velvet. Drinking the rot, the frost clinging to the fringe, a promise that this silence will outlive the body it covers. Waiting for the day when the orchard blooms and the hush must open its mouth once more. When dawn climbs high enough to bleach the orchard frost to water, the hush lifts just enough for footsteps to break it slow. Deliberate, each boot placed with the care of men who know they carry more than a body through the courtyard's ancient stones. The king's bier, draped in its heavy velvet cloth rimmed in stiff gold fringe, floats above 4 pairs of shoulders bent beneath its weight. The hush clings to them all, to the linen wrapped tight around the jaw beneath the funeral cloth, to the stale herbs tucked near the corpse's ribs, to the breath each man holds between his teeth, so as not to taste what lies under the velvet. The courtyard stands ringed in watchers who do not dare draw close. Servants press against the walls, heads bowed low, eyes flicking from the bier to the orchard gate that will swallow the king's last passage through these grounds. A woman who once carried jugs to his table wipes her nose on her sleeve, though. No tears come. Stable lad picks at the ragged cuff of his coat, remembering the boots that once kicked mud from these flagstones and the hush that trembles now, where hoofbeats used to echo bright and sharp as iron bells ahead of the bier walks. The priest, shoulders hunched inside his patched cloak, psalter dangling from numb fingers. His Latin seeps into the hush like water into dry earth, syllables lost before they rise above the frost that still crusts the edges of the old fountain. He chants softly, voice cracking at each name that must now be folded into the hush. King, father, husband. Lion titles turn to rust when the breath stops and the velvet cloth pulls tight across bloated limbs that no crown can lift again. The courtyard walls remember. Capstone holds the scrape of boots, the hush of old. Feasts. The roar of a voice that called for dogs and wine and more when the moon sat high and the orchard branches were heavy with blossom. Now the hush is different. Not the thunder of a living man, but the soft, thick silence of a corpse carried past the hedges that once knew his laugh. Near the low arch that opens to the orchard path, the fox waits, fur bristled against the chill. Its nose twitches at the scent drifting off the bier, the ripe rot wrapped tight in velvet and prayers. It does not flee, only watches, yellow eyes wide as the hush brushes its ears. Somewhere behind the fox, the orchard roots shift in the thawing soil. Drinking in what the hush spills drop by drop, secrets turn sweet in the dark earth. Words that will bloom again when the trees blossom white come spring. One of the bearers stumbles at the edge of the flagstones, boot heels slipping on moss left wet by the melting frost. The bier tilts just enough for the hush to press tighter against the cloth. A dull sound comes from within, the soft roll of flesh swollen in its wrapping. The slosh of humors that will find their way into the rushes tonight if the grave does not close its mouth fast enough. The priest's voice hitches but does not break. He lifts his psalter higher, words spilling into the hush, trying to bind it closed before it can slip down the orchard lane ahead of them. Behind the bier, the steward walks, stiff-legged, gloved hands clasped at his belly, head lowered to the hush that clings to every gold thread stitched into the funeral cloth. He thinks of the crown waiting on its cushion, cold as frost, heavy as the hush pressing. Into his chest, he imagines the orchard gate ahead, the iron latch swung wide, the hush drifting out through its rusted hinges like breath from lips sewn shut. A pair of maids stand near the old herb garden wall, fingers linked under a shared shawl. They do not whisper. The hush does not allow it. They watch the bier pass like a cart piled high with orchard clippings. Nothing but waste now. Dragged from root to ditch so new growth might come when the snowmelt slips under the garden door. The fox steps aside. When the bier reaches the archway, its tail flicks once against the frostbitten hedge. The bearers pause, shoulders quivering under the hush that folds around the king's weight like wet wool. The priest lifts his psalter, Latin catching on the cold wind, the hush pressing back. So each word tastes of old stone and orchard bark. When they move again, the hush goes with them. Past the hedges where frost drips from tangled branches. Past the orchard's bare rows, roots waking in the thaw. Past the mossy walls that remember boots heavier than any crown could weigh. The hush trails behind the bier, slipping through the footprints left in the courtyard stones. Sealing each one over with frost, the sun will never warm quite enough to make them forget. And when the last edge of the funeral cloth brushes the archway stones, the hush gathers up what remains, the rot, the fear, the final breath pinned. Inside the linen, carrying it out under the orchard trees where the earth waits with open arms, ready to cradle a king, turns soft and silent. Fed back to the hush that made him, beyond the courtyard gate, where the orchard soil lies brittle and wet under the thawing frost. A pit waits, carved by rough spades, swung in the hush before dawn. Roots curl like dark veins at the grave's edge, clawing at the cold air that rises from the open hole. Here, the hush gathers thick and low, pressing against the spade handles, brushing the ankles of the gravediggers who bend their heads each time the wind breathes over the orchard wall. A line of men stands nearby, boots planted in the churned mud, shoulders hunched against the orchard's hush. Each pair of eyes drifts between the open grave and the bier resting on its trestles under a rough canvas awning. The funeral cloth sags at the corners, soaked dark where the king's body sweats its final sweetness into the velvet folds. Man lifts the edge to peek beneath, then drops it at once, the hush leaping into his throat before any word can slip free. At the foot of the pit, the priest kneels in the half-shadow of the orchard trees, psalter balanced on his thigh. The roots above him drip melt water into the churned soil, soft thuds that sound like knuckles rapping on an old door. His lips move Latin whispered into the hush that slips from the grave mouth like steam from a lidded pot. He knows no blessing will bind what waits to settle here. He knows the hush will burrow into the roots. Carrying secrets deeper than any worm, a single lantern flickers beside the bier, its glow dull against the weak dawn. Frost clings to the metal frame, beating into droplets that slide down the glass like tears no mourner dares shed here. One bearer rubs his palms together, breath fogging the hush that hangs between him and the open grave. He remembers the orchard. In summer, the branches heavy with fruit the king once plucked with a laugh that rang through the hedgerows like a threat. Now the hush holds that laugh tight, feeding it to the roots inch by inch. When the order comes, it comes soft, folded in the hush. 4 men lift the bier, boots sliding in the churned mud, shoulders braced against the sagging weight. The velvet. Cloth ripples, a shiver that catches the priest's eye as he raises his psalter higher. For a moment, the hush thickens. No birds, no fox steps in the frost, no branch creaks. Even the meltwater stills at the grave's lip, as the orchard holds its breath as the body passes between the rows of bare trees. The roots twitching below like fingers waiting to be fed. They lower the bier to the edge, canvas rasping against the wooden trestles. The steward steps forward, gloves streaked with soil, eyes locked on the dark maw, yawning wide at the orchard's heart. He lifts a corner of the velvet, folding it back to reveal the linen beneath, yellowed and puckered where the hush has seeped into the bruised flesh wrapped inside. He looks for a sign, a mark, a final word stitched into the hush where no lips could hold it, but there is nothing now, only rot. Heavy and still, with a nod, the bearers take up the corners of the cloth, breath hissing through their teeth as they guide the king's husk over the pit. The hush presses close. It tastes. A frost in stone and the slow sweetness of flesh breaking open. When the ropes slip through their hands, the linen groans. A sigh leaks from the folds, a pocket of air, a final echo of what the king once roared to men who now bend their heads to the hush. He has become. The body lands with a muffled thump on the straw bed laid at the grave's bottom. Dirt crumbles. From the sides, tumbling down in soft patters like a lullaby for roots that have waited all winter for this feast. The priest speaks again, voice drifting into the hush, each syllable rolling over the orchard's soil where worms stir awake in the thaw. His words promise mercy, promise peace, promise forgiveness. No crown can hold back once the hush decides its work is done, one by one. The men gather handfuls of dirt, letting the hush guide them as they scatter it over linen, gone slack with weight. The frost bites their knuckles, the orchard wind slipping under collars to steal warmth from their ribs. They do not look at each other, do not meet the eyes that dart like startled birds toward the orchard wall. The hush binds them a silence, thick as velvet, heavy as the rot they bury. When the last spade strikes the mound, the hush folds itself deep into the roots, carrying scraps of the king's last fear down where no priest's prayer can follow. The men stand a while longer, boots sinking into the churned earth, breath clouding the hush that drapes over the orchard like a blanket stitched with secrets. Above the grave, the bare branches stretch wide, limbs slick with meltwater that drips, drop by drop, into the new mound. Each drop carries the hush deeper. Each root curls tighter around the grave. And the orchard, quiet in the dawn, waits for spring to crack the hush open again, when blossoms bloom over bones turned soft as orchard soil, when secrets bloom white as frost dawn. When the grave is closed and the last spade leans forgotten against the orchard wall, the hush does not leave, sinks deeper instead, past the churned clumps of earth, past the straw matted to the linen that wraps what was once a roar of crown and command. It slides between roots, slick with thaw, winding tight around each new shoot that dreams of spring, even as it feeds on what the hush has hidden below. In the gray hush before the frost lifts for good, gardener stands alone, by the fresh mound. His boots sink into the soft earth, soles dark with the king's last damp offering to the orchard. He does not cross himself, does not speak. He holds his pruning knife in one hand, thumb worrying at the edge of the blade as if it might slice the hush into pieces small enough to scatter in the bramble, but it does not scatter. It clings to his sleeves, his breath, the tips of his fingers where dirt has settled in the half-moons of his nails. Around him, the orchard waits rows of trees older than the king's loudest boasts, older than the walls that once echoed with his hunting horns. Their branches stand bare now, knotted fists clutching the hush in buds so tight they squeak when the wind teases them apart. He thinks of how those branches will blossom soon, white and trembling, hush rising with the sap that drinks from the grave beneath. He kneels then, palm pressed to the mound where frost still beads like sweat on fresh-turned soil. Beneath his skin, the hush hums low, not words, not a voice, but the soft pull of secrets drifting into the root tips that tap against the king's linen shroud. Somewhere below, the orchard worms stir, slick bodies tasting the hush as it settles. Into the dark, he feels them move, the way a heartbeat stirs behind a sleeping rib. He wonders if the king feels them too, if any ghost that bloated body might hold clings to the hush as it burrows deeper than any crown can reach. Farther back, the fox watches from the tangled hedge where the frost clings longer than it should. Its ears flick at every shift of branch and boot, nose lifting to catch the hush that smells of rot and blossom all at once. It will come closer tonight when the gardener leaves, when the hush grows sweet enough to draw small teeth to the grave's edge. The orchard knows this. The hush has fed foxes before. A wind rattles the dead apple limbs, sending a soft drift of last season's shriveled leaves skittering over the mound. They catch in the gardener's boot heel, brush against his wrist where the pruning knife gleams. Dull in the dawn light, he does not brush them away. Let them settle. Let them press the hush tighter to the grave. A blanket of old breath and orchard sleep above him. A rook lands on the branch of the oldest tree, black wings folded neat, eyes bright and sharp. It cocks its head at the gardener, at the grave, at the hush that seeps up through the soil, like sap too thick to climb. Imagines it calling out, cracking the hush open with a single harsh cry. Oh, but the rook only watches, feathers puffed against. The orchard chill. The gardener rises at last, knees stiff, boot soles heavy with wet clay. He drags the back of his hand over his mouth, tasting the hush that lingers there like moss on a stone wall. When he turns away, the roots beneath the grave shiver, pulling tighter around the linen that now sags with the weight of its final warmth. He leaves the spade by the wall, leans there, blade dark, waiting to be claimed by the hush when no one's looking. The orchard holds its silence. The roots creep on, drinking slow, drawing each secret down into knots and veins that will bear. Sweet blossom comes spring, and the hush, full now, folds itself under bark and branch, sleeping soft in the orchard's belly, waiting to open its mouth again when the white petals fall like ghosts in the king's last. Breath rises with the scent of bloom. When dusk creeps low through the orchard rows, bleeding what little warmth remains into the bramble's thorny hush, the fox returns. Its paws press softly into the churned soil near the grave, each step stitching a fresh seam in the hush that has settled so deep it hums against the frostbitten roots. The air tastes of rotting velvet now, of old linen and sweat that has slipped. Loose from flesh gone slack in its shroud, the fox pauses beside the mound, nose twitching. Its breath curls white above the dirt, where frost beads and delicate scallops along the edge of the spade still propped against the garden wall. The hush breathes too, shifting beneath the roots where worms slide slick through straw turned sweet with decay. No lanterns burn here, no boots scrape the orchard path, only the hush and the fox alone together in the hush of a king's final sleep. Above, the bare branches rattle, catching the last scraps of dusk light in their knots. Old bark splits where the frost has worked its teeth all winter. Sap slow to wake, roots greedy for what the hush has offered up. The fox sniffs at the mound's peak, where the soil is softest, where the velvet cloth that once wrapped a king now lies pressed tight to the bones beneath. It circles once, tail brushing the leaves that scatter like scraps of torn parchment. There is no fear here. The orchard knows this fox as well as it knows the hush. It has watched the same black-tipped ears slip beneath hedgerows in the hush of dawn hunts and slip out again. When blood bloomed bright across the grass, now the fox hunts something older than flesh, the soft promise of warmth buried in the hush. The secrets that slip free when the grave breathes out, it digs with careful paws. Claws pulling up tufts of thawed earth, each scrape a soft tear. In the hush, worms squirm through the clumps, blind and fat on the velvet stain. The fox snuffles at them, teeth snapping only when the hush sighs too close. Above, the orchard watches, roots twitching deeper as if to shield what's left from teeth that would taste the king's hush and carry it out on their breath into the hedgerow. A wind rattles the branches, sending a scatter of shriveled crabapples tumbling down the slope toward the old orchard wall. The fox lifts its nose, fur bristling at the scent of stone and damp moss that carries the hush back from the grave's hollow. It knows the hush will not feed it, not the way blood does, not the way marrow does. But still it stays, pressing, its belly to the dirt, ears laid flat to the hush that thrums beneath near the garden wall. The spade shifts in the wind, tapping softly against the stone like a knuckle on a coffin lid. The fox flinches, eyes darting to the shadow where the orchard gate stands half ajar. Beyond it, the frost lies unbroken, waiting to creep back over the grave's mound when night sinks its claws into the orchard path once more. The fox noses the dirt one last time, claws raking the loose soil that smells of linen, of sweat, of the hush that tastes of secrets too bitter to swallow whole. It circles the mound again, prints pressed deep where the frost has fled the hush's warmth. Then it slips back through the tangled hedge, tail brushing the brambles that snag fur and hush alike, carrying a single thread of the king's last, breath back to its den under the orchard roots. Above the grave, the branches settle, bark groaning as the hush presses down. The roots drink slow, wrapping tighter around the damp linen buried below. The fox does not look back. Its paws leave a trail in the churned earth, tiny scars the thaw will wash away come spring. And the hush, full now with one more secret tugged loose by a nose and claws, closes its mouth again, curling deep under the orchard's frozen skin, waiting for the first bloom to crack it open once more. Inside the great hall, where banners once caught candlelight like cloth of gold, the hush has woven itself into every beam and nail. The hearth burns low but steady, logs cracking with a damp sweetness that cannot warm the shadows gathered high in the rafters. Tonight, the long table is laid not with platters of roast or jugs of brimming ale, but with a thin spread of bread, cold joints, and a single jug of sour wine poured sparingly into pewter cups that clink soft as bones when lifted. The courtiers sit at the table's edge, cloaks wrapped tight around shoulders that bear the hush like an old cloak of state. Their voices drift no higher than the snap of a fat log splitting in the hearth. They sip, they tear the bread with careful fingers, but their eyes do not meet for long. Each glance slides away toward the end of the table where the king's chair stands empty, its carved arms heavy with dust that no servant has dared wipe away since the hush took root there. A steward stands just behind the empty seat, hands folded. At his belly, fixed on the way, the hush pools around the untouched goblet meant for the king's lips, lips that now lie sewn shut under linen somewhere. Beyond the orchard wall, he feels the hush pressing at his throat each time he draws, a breath thick as old gravy left cold on a pewter plate. He wonders if any of them taste it too, the sour slip of secrets that rose with the rot when they laid him in the orchard earth, near the hearth. A servant girl leans into the flames, turning the spit though nothing roasts there tonight. Iron squeaks under her hand, each crank a tiny rebellion against the hush that nests in the shadows above her. She imagines the roasts that once dripped fat to the rush's whole boar. Swan, stag, hunted through orchard and field by a king whose laughter cut through the hush, like a cleaver through bone. Now the hush roars back, thick enough to drown her thoughts in the low crackle of the fire. At the table, two nobles murmur over the rim of a single cup, words stitched together in the hush like mice nesting in straw. They speak of who might wear the crown next, whose hand will steady the hush when it threatens to slip the walls, and drown every oath they swore in better light. Their breath steams in the chill that leaks from the flagged floor, seeping up through boot soles to remind them the orchard hush waits just beyond the shuttered windows, roots sucking secrets. Through the frost-hardened ground, a page stands by the door, cloak pulled tight around his ears. He watches the hush drift from cup to goblet, sees how it settles on shoulders draped in fur and velvet that smell faintly of mothballs and candle soot. He wonders if the hush tastes the same for each of them, if it clings to their hair like cold smoke, if it sits behind their eyes, where old lies gather dust. When a cup is set back on the table, he slips forward to wipe its rim clean, fingers trembling where the hush slips under his nails. The steward shifts, gaze drifting up to the rafters, where cobwebs tremble in the draft that slips through the gaps in the shutters. He remembers banquets when the hush fled at the roar of a song, when boots stamped the rushes into the flagstones, when the king's voice rose high enough to shake the iron latches on the gallery doors. He wonders if the hush will ever flee again, or if it will stay now, stitched to every tapestry, every plank of the table where crumbs fall, and no dog dares come to catch them. When the bread is gone, pewter cups stand dry in the candlelight, their rims dull with the hush's breath. The nobles rise one by one, cloaks trailing the hush like funeral banners dragging through wet grass. No toast is called, no final word breaks the hush that presses tight to the king's empty chair. Only the fire keeps its voice a low crackle that hisses in the shadows where the hush curls to listen. Outside, the orchard wind rattles the shutters, a soft knock that sounds too much like the hush asking to come in. The page bows as the last of the courtiers slip down the gallery, boots scuffing the rushes that smell of old meat and colder secrets. The servant girl still turns the spit, though the iron holds nothing but the hush spinning round and round. Above the low fires, sigh, and in the hush that remains. The empty chair waits would worn smooth by a hand that once gripped its arm like a scepter, now gripped instead by roots and worms beneath the orchard soil. The hush breathes through the great hall rafters, soft and slow, carrying the taste of rot and velvet out past the shuttered windows, drifting to where the orchard roots feed. And the crown waits for a brow brave enough to silence the hush. Again, when the last goblet is cleared, and the great hall's hearth sinks to a dull red glow, the hush drifts up to the tapestries that hang along the long stone walls. They billow once in the draft that creeps under the heavy doors, then settle back. Folds heavy with the scent of old smoke and the sharp temps of frost that clings to the courtyard just beyond. Each tapestry keeps its stories close. threads stitched by hands who never spoke their truths aloud. One shows a stag brought low in the orchard clearing. Its flank pierced by an arrow shot from the king's bow, the hush soaks into the red silk of its wound, pulling every sigh of the beast's final breath into the weave where no courtiers' eyes ever linger for long. Another hangs near the hearth, so close that candle soot has ghosted its edge. A banquet scene, long tables groaning with swans and boars, the king's figure at the head, hand raised in toast. The hush curls around. The painted goblet slides down the embroidered sleeve, pools in the eyes of courtiers, rendered in tiny knots of silk. It remembers every name whispered over meat and spiced wine, every promise sewn behind fans and fur collars. When the king's roar was enough to drown the hush for a heartbeat, in the far corner, where the shadows cling longest, a tapestry hangs. Half-torn a queen, her head bowed, a scrap of orchard behind her, stitched in green and white. The hush settles deepest. It drinks from the threads that hold her breath just before the axe fell, from the careful cross-stitches that hold her eyes closed so no one sees how wide they might have opened. The hush remembers. It gathers in the warp and weft, feeding on the sorrow that seeps from the old wool like sap from a frost-split bow. A maid moves along the hall's edge, small feet muffled by the rushes. She carries a taper, its glow a fragile bubble that pushes the hush back an arm's length as she lifts it to inspect each tapestry's edge. She brushes away a strand of cobweb here, a dust flake there. But the hush presses at her shoulder, cold as orchard wind, reminding her that no rag will scrub away what the threads have swallowed. She knows this. They all do. That is why they do not speak as they pass these walls, why they bow their heads as if the hush might catch their secrets and bind them tight to the stone if they dare meet the eyes of the figures stitched into linen and silk near the old stag's dying breath. The hush trembles when a door creaks open, just enough for a draft to slip through, carrying a bite of orchard frost. It dances along the tapestry's bottom edge, lifts the embroidered leaves so they seem to flutter in the candlelight. The maid draws her shawl close, breath misting in the hush as she steps away. She imagines she hears the leaves whisper. Is it the hush threading another secret into the seam where the king's name still echoes? A page lingers by the banquet scene, boots scuffing the rushes in slow circles. His eyes drift to the king's tiny stitched smile, the way the hush folds around it now like damp velvet. He wonders if the man's laughter ever truly filled this hall, or if the hush always waited in the rafters for the moment the roar cracked open. He lifts a corner of the tapestry with trembling fingers, half expecting to find the hush coiled there, breathing its orchard breath across his knuckles. But there is only cold stone, smelling faintly of candle soot and old blood long scrubbed from the flags. The hearth sighs behind him, logs splitting in the ashes with a pop that rattles the hush but does not break it. The tapestries sway once, more than grow still. They are full now, full of the hush that presses its secrets into every twist of thread, every beat of guilt that catches the candlelight like a watchful eye. When the page leaves, when the maid snuffs her taper and slips away down the corridor, the hush closes its mouth again. It hums through the threads, folds itself deep behind the hunting horns and banquet goblets, drips through the orchard leaves embroidered at the edge of every scene, and in that hush, the tapestries breathe slow, soft, woven lungs that remember. The king's last word, the orchard's open grave, the crown waiting in the dark. The hush keeps all of it, stitched tight where no blade or flame can pick the seams apart. And when new boots tread these rushes, when new laughter dares to rise and chase the hush to the rafters once more, the tapestries will still be here, watching, breathing, keeping the hush safe in every quiet thread. When the hush settles so thick, the rushes underfoot forget how to rustle. The priest slips away from the hall where tapestries keep their watch. Soft shoes leave no mark on the cold flags, breath held tight in his chest, lest the hush snatch it from him before he's ready to give it up. In the courtyard he pauses, hand pressed to the old oak door of the bell tower, a rough grain beneath his palm, cold and damp with the hush that clings here thicker than moss. He pushes the door inward, its iron hinges sighing just once. Inside. The belfry stair winds upward like a spine broken by too many tolls. Each step is a shallow bowl worn by feet who have carried the hush up and down for centuries. He takes them slow, breath feathering the stones. Psalter clutched so tight the edge of its leather binding bites his palm. The hush follows him, curls around his ankles, brushes his throat where the collar of his robe no longer holds warmth. Above him, the bell waits in its wooden cradle, its tongue dark with rust and secrets spit out in iron notes at every birth. Every wedding, every death, this hush has ever cradled. When the king's last breath rattled free, this bell rang out once, twice. Then again and again, until the orchard roots stirred in the frost to drink the sound down deep. Now it stands quiet, the hush pressing into its bowl like a promise. Sealed in iron, the priest reaches the landing. Boots soft on planks so old they creak like old ribs shifting under winter's chill. He sets the psalter on the ledge by the narrow window where orchard wind slips in, raw enough to sting the hush into new shapes. He stands a moment, fingers curled at the sill, eyes drifting through the slanted glass to the orchard's broken frost, the grave just beyond the hedge, mound dark under the half-moon's milk-white hush. He breathes out a single word. A name so soft it snags on the hush before it can leave the stone walls. He does not say it again. Names have teeth when spoken near the hush. Better to keep them folded into prayers, tucked under the psalter's worn cover where no root or worm can tug them loose. He flips the pages, lips moving as his thumb finds the lines inked years ago when the king's voice still thundered beneath. This bell, when mercy was a coin flipped in the hush of a closed confessional. He prays for the orchard roots to hold tight, for the hush to keep what it was given, for the crown waiting in its chamber to find a brow strong enough to bear what the hush will never forget. His voice breaks when the wind slips through the belfry slats, lifting the hem of his robe, brushing the hush over his knuckles where the psalter quivers. He thinks he hears the bell stir, iron scraping wood, the hush testing its tongue for a word it will not speak until the frost blooms again. Below, courtyard breathes its hush through the half-open door. Somewhere a fox cries, quick and sharp, a note that slips under the hush like a blade. The priest closes his eyes, shoulders bending beneath the weight of the orchard's secrets. He presses his hand to the bell's cold rim, feels the hush trapped in its iron belly, echoing the king's final moan, the orchard's soft hunger, the crown's waiting roar. He pulls his hand back as if burned. The hush sticks to his palm, a chill that creeps under his skin and stays there, humming behind his ribs like a psalm too old to remember by heart. He snaps the psalter shut. The hush does not flinch. He whispers once more into the belfry gloom, a word meant for no ear, but the hush that keeps this place alive, long after kings turned soft in orchard graves. When he steps back down the stair, the hush follows him, a thin thread unwinding from the bell's throat, coiling round his ankles, slipping under the chapel door where tomorrow's prayers will echo too small to matter. He pulls the oak door shut behind him. The latch snicks into place like a promise. The hush inside the belfry settles once more, pressed tight against the rusted tongue and the stone walls that have heard every oath. Every lie, every word, a dying man begged the hush to carry into the orchard roots before the frost cracked him. Open and outside, in the orchard's shifting hush, the bell stands ready. Silent now, iron tongue heavy, waiting for the day its roar must break the hush wide open again. When dawn cracks a thin line of bruised gold across the orchard wall, the hush beneath the frost breathes out in slow pulses, as if the grave itself sighs through the tangled roots. Beneath the mound where velvet and linen sag against a hollow rib cage, the orchard roots press closer, thin fingers winding through straw and damp cloth, licking the salt and iron from what remains of the kings. Final warmth in the hush below, worms weave slow paths around the softening bones. Each shift of the orchard wind above is felt here, a vibration in the soil that stirs the hush-like breath caught under a burial shroud. Oh, no priest's psalm reaches this far down. No Latin blessing binds the hush once the earth splits open. To swallow secrets that drip from the seams of velvet gone slick with rot, a root finds a seam in the linen, slips inside where the hush tastes sweetest. It wraps a brittle rib, its pale tendril pressing to marrow that now crumbles to black silt. Above the orchard branches sway, groaning under the weight of frost, turn to drip, each drop feeding the hush that slicks the grave's rim. When the melt reaches the roots, it carries with it the taste of candle smoke, wax, and rose water that could not keep the king whole. Fox prints circle the grave, small dents pressed into the churned earth. The hush knows their shape, how the paws tread lightly at dusk, how the nose dips to catch the Thames of rot that rises when the orchard thaw begins in earnest. God, it does not mind. The hush welcomes teeth and claws, it welcomes worms and roots. It remembers what flesh must become, and the orchard roots do their work with a patience the crown never knew. A robin flits down from the branches above, head cocked, breast bright against the hush-heavy soil. Its feet press tiny dimples at the grave's crown, where frost melts faster than in the shaded rows. It pecks at a worm surfacing to breathe, tugging it free in one clean motion. A small thread of the hush lifts with the worm's squirm, then settles back when the robin wings away. Song sharp and bright against the hush that thickens once more around the king's bones. Deep under the orchard's oldest tree, a root thicker. Then a man's wrist curls through stones that remember the first frost of this graveyard. The first hush laid down, when the orchard was nothing but wild thorn and wind. It drinks slow from the grave, drawing the king's final secrets into its pulp. Sap will rise here when warmth returns. Buds will break open, white petals blushing with the hush buried in their veins. If a gardener passes by, spade in hand, he will see only the dark mound, the soft sag where the soil sinks under the king's weight. He may pause, palm pressed too, the cool bark overhead, feeling the hush shift beneath his boots. He will say nothing, for the hush is not for speaking. It is for roots to keep, for blossoms to wear, when the orchard blooms wild and soft, scattering the king's last breath in petals that drift down to carpet the earth, where fox and worm and robin circle back to taste what power cannot hold. No crown weighs on this hush now, only soil, frost, root, and rot. When the sun stands higher, the thaw will quicken, the hush will loosen like silk unraveling, weaving its sweetness through the orchard beds. The king's secrets will slip from marrow to root, from root to sap, from sap to blossom, until every branch hums with the hush that drank him deep, fed him back to the earth, and remembers him without name, throne, or roar. Above, a breeze stirs, the bare limbs, the hush sighs, the grave holds. The orchard roots drink on. When dusk comes again, and the orchard hush folds itself thick around the mound, a single servant picks his way down the path between rows of trees gone dark and brittle. With frost, holds a stub of candle cupped inside one palm, the flame bowing low each time the hush breathes against it. The orchard roots listen as his boots crack through fallen twigs, a sound too loud for a hush so deep it could swallow his footsteps whole. He stops at the grave's edge, where the churned soil has sunk a finger's breadth since the thaw began. The hush here tastes stronger, as if the king's final warmth still rises in thin ribbons that the frost cannot quite swallow. Servant kneels, setting the candle stub in the shallow dip of the mound's crown. Wax dribbles onto the loose soil, catching in the straw and scraps of bark the wind carried here. His hands hover above the flame. He remembers how those hands once brushed the king's sleeves smooth, pinched the collar tight around a throat that now lies slack and soft under velvet, gone wet with the hush. He wonders if the hush remembers him, the boy who carried bread to the orchard bench on mornings when the king demanded sweet rolls and cold wine before the hunt began. He wonders if it matters now that his name was never spoken in the same breath as crowns or scrolls or velvet cushions carried from bedchamber to tomb. The hush curls round his knees, pressing into the wool of his breeches, dampening the warmth that leaks from the candle's small flame. He glances up, half expecting to see a fox's eyes catch the flicker from the bramble, or the robin pecking at the last soft worms that slip too close to the air. But the orchard holds still tonight. Roots shift beneath him, a slow tightening that feels like a heartbeat lodged deep in the soil. He takes the edge of his sleeve, dips it into the flame until the cloth darkens and curls. The hush does not flinch. It laps at the smoke drifting up, the scent of singed wool folding into the hush that breathes out from the grave's soft belly. He presses the smoldering cloth to the soil beside the candle stub, a gesture that feels like penance, though no priest told him to come. A breeze rattles the orchard branches. Frost flakes drift down, catching in his hair, settling on the crown of the mound where the hush gathers like damp breath on a pane of glass. He watches the roots drink from the thawed crust, imagines them coiling tighter around the king's ankles, slipping between ribs grown brittle, tugging each secret deeper into the orchard's belly. He wants to speak, a word, a name, a wish for forgiveness the hush might cradle for him. But his tongue sticks to the roof of his mouth. The hush slides between his teeth instead, carrying the words down to the roots where they twist among the worms and scraps of velvet. So he stays silent. He touches the candle's wax where it pools at the base, feeling it cool under his thumb. Behind him, the orchard gate creaks. He does not look back. He knows no steward stands there to drag him away. No guards come to demand. The hush keep its promise with spears and boots and cold iron keys. The orchard hush needs no witness, needs no guard. It only needs the root and the frost, the fox and the worm. The soft candle flame flickering at the grave's edge like a single breath caught between winter and the thaw. He stands at last. His knees creak, straw clings to his palms. The hush pulls at his cuffs as he wipes his hands against his coat. Leaves the candle burning low, flame bobbing, when the orchard wind shifts through the branches overhead. He does not look back when he slips through the orchard gate. Boots pressing soft marks into soil that will remember him long after his name has turned to hush among the roots behind him. The flame gutters once bends sideways, then settles. The hush folds around it, tasting the smoke that drifts into the orchard's waiting mouth. And beneath the mound, the roots drink deep, carrying the servant's silence down where the king's secrets sleep, warm for a heartbeat longer before. The hush binds them tight again in the orchard's dark, slow, and forever hungry earth. Inside the chamber where the crown waits, the hush has settled so deep that even the hearth's small flame flickers without warmth. The velvet cushion beneath the crown has grown pale at its edges, the damp breath of the orchard drifting in. Through cracks in the window led, carrying with it a whisper of frost that beads along the gold band's inner curve. The steward stands close to the table, shoulders hunched inside a heavy cloak, eyes fixed on the way the hush pools around the crown's base. He can almost see it, the hush like thin frost spidering out across the velvet, a bloom of pale crystals clinging to the gold filigree. It is the same hush that presses against the orchard gate at dawn, the same hush that curls under the mound, where the king's final breath still feeds the roots that creep toward blossom. He wants to lift it, to feel its weight, to test the cold iron hidden beneath the bright gold that no page or priest will ever speak of aloud. But his gloved fingers twitch, then fall still. He knows the hush would slip up his sleeve, burrow beneath his collar, stain the pulse that beats beneath his throat. He has seen what the hush does when it settles on a brow unready to bare its teeth. Beside the cushion, a shallow dish of embers struggles to keep its glow. The hush drifts over it, smothering the faint scent of rosemary tossed on the coals by. The old priest before dawn. Each needle crackled for a moment, then folded into the hush like a word bitten off before the tongue could finish its shape. The steward watches the embers sigh, a soft pop breaking the hush for a breath before it folds back around the crown like a cloak drawn tight. At the far side of the chamber, a page kneels on the rushes, polishing the gilt edges of the old ledger, where names have been scratched and crossed, ink smeared by too many trembling hands. The hush presses against his ribs as he works, a cold weight that makes each breath feel like drawing frost into his throat. He dares not look at the crown. He keeps his eyes on the leather binding, his fingers tracing the pressed seal that binds all these secrets under a single royal crest. Outside the window, orchard branches clatter together as the wind shifts. A flake of frost slips through the gap. In the leaded glass, drifting onto the velvet, the steward leans closer, eyes wide as the hush lifts that single flake onto the crown's lower rim, a pale thorn against the gold. A sign that the orchard roots have tasted what they were promised. He lifts one gloved hand, fingertips hovering just above the frost. It would take so little to brush it away, a single stroke, a small warmth pressed into the hush. But he leaves it because the hush has settled its claim. Rooting this chamber to the orchard where the king lies soft beneath the mound, the page's quill scratches the parchment. A sound too loud in the hush. He dips it again, the ink thin from cold, the letters wobbled by his cramped wrist. He writes what must be written, the line that will bind the crown to the next brow, the words that must be spoken when the hush opens its mouth wide enough to let them through. A coal shifts in the ember dish. Ash curls upward, catching the hush in thin gray threads that drift toward the window crack. The steward watches them, eyes gone soft and damp, lashes clumped with the hush that always finds its way into any warmth left unguarded. He thinks of the orchard fox slipping through the grave's frost, the candle stub left burning at the mound's edge. He wonders if the roots feel the frost that beads now on the crown's rim. Tiny pearls that will melt when a new hand lifts this gold into dawn's pale bloom. The hush does not speak. It breathes instead, settling heavier on the velvet, folding the frost deeper into the cushion's threads. The steward steps back, boots scuffing the rushes. The page lowers his quill, parchment left half-finished in the hush that holds each. Name tight as a secret folded in a dead man's sleeve. No voice dares rise in this chamber. No hand dares touch the crown. Waits, rim traced in orchard frost, velvet chilled where the hush dreams of roots and bone. Outside, the wind sighs. Through bare branches, carrying the hush back toward the orchard mound. And here in this cold stone room, the crown listens, patient, hungry for the moment when the hush must lift, the frost must crack, and a new brow must bend to bear what the hush keeps hidden in its frozen gold. When the new moon lifts, its thin white blade above the orchard, the hush stirs beneath the hedgerow, where frost still clings like lace to the brambles. The fox slips through the tangled roots, its belly low to the earth that breathes slow and damp above the king's buried bones. Each step leaves a faint mark in the thawing crust, a trail pressed deep enough that by dawn the hush will have drunk it down into the roots. It pauses near the grave mound, nose twitching at the cold that hangs in the hush like a question left unanswered. The soil has settled more since the last dusk, the small candle stub long gone, wax softened into the straw where the hush keeps. It hidden with scraps of linen and the tiny bones of worms too slow to burrow deep enough before the frost came. Above the mound, the orchard trees stand bare as the fox lifts its head to the new moon. Thin branches scrape together, a sound too faint to break the hush but sharp enough to remind the fox that the roots are not yet done with their feast. It circles once, tail flicking, ears pinned flat each time a twig snaps under its careful step. Somewhere beyond the grave, the wind shifts. The hush slips from tree to tree, brushing the fox's flank, stirring the scent that seeps from the soil. A sharp tempest of rot now softened by the sweetness of thaw. The fox tastes it on its tongue, teeth clicking, as it noses the grave's crown. It does not dig. The hush hums beneath its paws, telling it there is nothing left worth tearing open. The roots have claimed what the flesh could offer. The orchard does not share what it keeps below. A rook stirs on a branch above, feathers fluffed against the hush. Its eyes glint like beads of iron as it watches the fox circle the grave. The hush coiling round their shadows where the new moon paints them silver and thin. For a moment, fox and rook and hush breathe together. Three small shapes bound by roots that slip deeper each time the frost breaks. The fox lifts its nose, scenting the air that drifts in from the house beyond the orchard wall. It smells the crown's hush too, the frost on the velvet cushion, the stale fear pressed between ledger pages inked with names no root will ever hold. It knows the hush does not stop at the orchard's edge. It slides under doors, curls up stairwells, waits in the shadows of stone halls that once shook when the king's boots slammed across the flags. But here, the hush belongs to the roots. The fox knows this. It licks its paw once, ears flicking. At a mouse rustling under a nearby bramble, the mouse freezes, breath caught in the hush that smells of bone and damp linen. The fox lets it go, nose dipping to the grave's rim for a final taste of the hush that seeps from beneath. A breeze stirs the mound's crown, lifting a scatter of leaves too old to remember green. They drift across the fox's back, caught in its fur until they slip free, settling again where the hush folds them into the soil like a promise no voice will speak. The rook shifts, claws scraping bark. The fox flicks its tail once more, then melts back into the hedgerow, its paws silent on the thawing path. When it goes, the hush closes behind it. It's pressing soft and thick around the grave where roots still. Drink deep of the king's last sweetness. The orchard waits. The wind hums through the bare limbs. The new moon rides high, thin blades slicing shadows into smaller hushes that nestle beneath the roots. And the fox, belly low, nose lifted to the wind that tastes of frost and rot and secrets folded in velvet, disappears into the hush that will. Keep it warm until the orchard blooms again. When the orchard finally shivers awake under the pale promise of spring, the hush shifts with it. Slow at first, a soft stirring beneath the frost-crumbled soil where roots press tight around what remains of the king's last breath. Buds swell along the old branches. Sap humming up from the grave where linen has long since gone soft, where bones bend to the hush like straw left to the thaw. Above the grave mound, the grass returns in thin green shoots, pushing through the churned earth in small trembling blades. The hush welcomes them, curling around each tender tip like a mother's hand smoothing a fevered brow. A fox slips past at dawn, muzzle streaked with dew, tail flicking frost from last year's brambles. Its nose dips once at the mound's crown, but the hush keeps its secrets buried deep. Roots wrapped so tight, not even sharp teeth could find them now. A robin hops between the orchard rows, wings flicking the hush into soft ripples that spread through the budding branches overhead. Its breast glows like a coal in the dawn light, a single heartbeat of red among the hush's slow bloom. It pecks at the mound, tugging a worm from soil sweet with what the hush has fed it all winter. One tug, and the hush releases the thread, drawing the secret deeper while giving just enough to feed the orchard's restless chorus. Near the hedge, the gardener kneels in last season's damp straw, palms pressed flat to the thawing soil. His fingers comb through the roots where the hush breathes warm now, a warmth that carries the taste of old velvet. Broken bones, a crown too heavy to lift. He feels it there, the hush pulsing under his calloused fingertips like sap pressed against soft wood. He does not speak. There is nothing left to say. The hush needs no words once the orchard roots have taken hold. The branches above crack open. In small pops and sighs, petals pushing through like ghosts of the king's final sighs, stitched into silk and sweetened with sap. White blossoms split the hush into pieces, drifting down in slow spirals that settle on the grave mound. Each petal a tiny shroud for secrets buried deeper than any crown can reach beyond the orchard gate. The house watches with shuttered eyes. Inside, the crown still rests on its frost-kissed cushion. The hush folded in the gold's crevices where no new king has yet dared press his brow. But the roots know it is only a matter of time. They drink on, patient as frost, hungry as thaw. They wait for the hush to rise through stone and stairwell, to slip beneath the polished boots that will tread this orchard path when blossom drifts thick as snow. Ah! Breeze lifts the blossoms from the branches, carries them across the grave, scattering white petals into the hush like tiny promises. Some catch in the brambles, some cling to the gardener's cuffs. One lands on the fox's back as it slips back through the hedge, nose twitching at the hush that hums behind its sharp teeth. Beneath the mound, the roots flex like a fist unclenching. New shoots reaching deeper, where the hush keeps what remains soft and secret. Worms press between ribs, turn to powder. Sap threads through marrow, where the king's roar once lived. And the hush, warm now, swells through every vein of bark and branch, ready to bloom wider when the orchard is full awake. No song breaks it. No priest psalm carries this deep. The hush belongs to the roots now, to the blossom, to the fox's trail, to the grave that feeds what comes next. And when the petals fall thicker tomorrow, and the orchard hums with bees, tasting the hush in each new bloom. The grave will smile beneath its soft crown of grass and flowers, its secrets stitched tight into the hush that feeds the orchard on and on and on. When the orchard stands in full blossom, petals piled thick along the hedgerows and drifted like pale snow against the old grave mound, the hush settles into its deepest sleep. It curls under the roots, heavy with the sweetness of rot turned to sap. Secrets pressed so tight, they taste now of blossom honey rather than fear and velvet decay at dawn. The air shimmers with the hush still clinging to each petal. Bees hum between the branches, wings stirring threads of hush into the flowering crowns. They crawl across the king's grave without pause, tiny legs brushing the soil where grass grows in soft tufts over the place. His bones lie folded tight as a promise never spoken aloud. The hush feeds them to each blossom a drop of the orchard's kept truth, carried far beyond the hedge on furred legs that do not know what they bear. Near the orchard wall, the gardener leans on his spade, eyes squinting into the branches. Overhead, petals drift into his hair, cling to the cuffs of his sleeves. He knows the hush when it shifts. He feels it tonight in the hum beneath his boots, the warmth that rises through the dark earth where the last frost has long since fled. Beneath him, the roots drink slow and deep, thick with the king's final sweetness. They hold it the way the crown still waits in its cold chamber, heavy with secrets sealed in frost that will not melt until hands far braver than his dare lift its hush into daylight again. The fox pads through the orchard rows, coat sleek tail, brushing the fallen petals into soft trails that mark where the hush seeps out. For a breath before curling back into the grave's roots, its eyes gleam bright in the first sunbeam that slips through the branches, catching the hush clinging to its fur like thistledown. It does not pause tonight. No paw scrapes the mound. No nose dips to taste what lies beneath. The hush has fed it all winter. The hush has nothing left to give but the promise that the roots will feed its kin when next the frost returns. A rook clatters from the orchard's highest limb, its wings scattering a flurry of petals onto the grave. Flake settles like a tiny shroud. Some slip between grass blades, pressed down by the hush that hums in the worms beneath. Some catch in the gardener's boot print, tucked there like a secret only the orchard keeps. He brushes one from his shoulder, but another lands in its place. He lets it stay. Beyond the orchard gate, the house holds its breath, somewhere inside. The steward shifts in the hush that seeps under every lintel, every doorframe. Tasting the frost the crown still clutches in its golden rim. He feels it even now, the hush that will never truly leave these walls, that will slip up the neck's brow and nest in the curls behind the ear of any man or boy foolish enough to think a throne is only wood and velvet. But here, beneath the orchard boughs, the hush softens. It tastes now of blossom and sap, old wounds folded into flower buds that open wide to the blue sky. No roar stirs these branches, no oath shatters the hush. The king's secrets rest easy in the soil, stitched into roots that push new shoots through the grave's crown until it seems a living thing, not a mound of old bones, but a cradle where hush and life have made a quiet truce. When dusk comes, the fox returns once more, its nose brushing a fresh scatter of petals that smell of sweet rot and green growth. The gardener lifts his spade, trailing hush and blossom alike back down the orchard row. Above, the rook settles on its branch, black wings tucked tight as the hush draws around its breast. The breeze sighs through the blossoms, rattling the hush loose for a heartbeat. It drifts like pollen, carried from grave to gate, from gate to crown, from crown to the roots that will drink it all back down again before the orchard hush falls still. And when summer finally opens its throat wide and the petals brown and drop into the soft grass, the hush will sleep deeper than ever, full now, patient now, waiting beneath the orchard's roots until the frost comes calling again to wake it.